I came home from a combat deployment in a wheelchair broken and learning how to walk all over again. Before I could even stand on my own 2 feet, my husband handed me divorce papers, packed his bags, and left me alone with our 3-month-old son. He told everyone he did not sign up to be a nursemaid. 10 years later, he stormed into my son's birthday dinner, demanding full custody and claiming I was an unfit, destitute cripple. He had no idea the judge was about to read a single, unclassified military document that would instantly drain the color from his face and send his new wife running for the exits. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled his entire life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe karma never misses a deadline. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room at a high-end downtown Atlanta restaurant flew open with a violent crash. My son Trey jumped, dropping his fork onto his porcelain plate. We were supposed to be celebrating his 10th birthday, just the two of us enjoying a quiet and peaceful evening. Instead, my ex-husband Jamal marched into the room, followed closely by his flashy new wife Chloe and his white sister-in-law Jessica, who always tagged along just to watch the drama unfold. Jamal did not offer a greeting. He did not look at his son to wish him a happy birthday. He marched straight to the head of the table, pulled a thick manila envelope from his tailored jacket, and slammed it directly into the center of Trey's custom birthday cake. Chocolate frosting and cake crumbs splattered violently across the pristine white tablecloth. "Sign the custody papers!" Zora Jamal demanded, his voice booming so loudly the waiters in the hallway stopped and stared through the glass partition. "I am taking my son. You could not even walk to the bathroom on your own 10 years ago when I left. You are unfit to raise a growing boy, and I am done letting him live in a charity ward." I did not cry. I did not shake. 10 years ago, the sound of Jamal yelling would have sent me into a full panic attack. Back then, I had just survived an improvised explosive device blast during a military cyber operations deployment. I came home with shattered legs and a 3-month-old baby, desperate for the man I loved to hold me together while I healed. Instead, Jamal drained our joint bank account of $60,000 and moved in with Chloe, leaving me to figure out how to feed our infant while navigating a wheelchair. But I was no longer that broken 25-year-old girl. I reached across the table, calmly pulled the manila envelope out of the ruined cake, and used a linen napkin to wipe the frosting off the edges. I glanced at Trey, who was watching his father with wide, frightened eyes. I placed my hand gently over my son's hand, silently shielding him from the chaotic, toxic energy his father brought into the room. "You ruined my cake," Dad, Trey said softly, his voice trembling just a little bit. Jamal barely looked down at him. "I will buy you a 10-tier cake next week when you come live with us at our new mansion in Buckhead, son. You need a complete wealthy family to raise you right, not a broken veteran living on government disability checks." Chloe stepped up beside Jamal, sneering as she flashed a massive diamond ring that caught the light of the expensive chandelier above us. She looked me up and down, her lips curling into a mocking, satisfied smile. "Trey needs an active mother, Zora. Someone who can actually run around the yard with him and take him on real vacations. Not someone hiding in a cheap townhouse popping painkillers all day." Jessica, Jamal's sister-in-law, peeked from behind Chloe's shoulder. She offered me a pitying, deeply condescending smile. "It is really brave of you to shop at discount stores and try to look presentable for Trey's birthday, Zora. We know those military checks do not stretch very far, especially in this economy." I looked at Jessica, taking in her smug, pale face. She was married to Jamal's brother Terrence, and she always loved pretending she was part of some elite high society that I could never possibly access. I did not defend my wardrobe. The custom silk dress I was wearing cost more than Jessica's entire outfit, but correcting her right now was a waste of breath. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my voice completely level. "That is a very bold statement, Jessica, especially coming from someone whose husband just begged me for a personal loan last Tuesday to keep your cars from being repossessed by the bank." Jessica's smug smile vanished instantly. The color drained from her cheeks and she took a quick step backward, looking around nervously to see if anyone else had heard my revelation. Chloe whipped her head around to look at Jessica, clearly confused by the sudden shift in power, but Jamal was far too busy puffing out his chest to notice the sudden tension among his own cheerleaders. "Do not try to change the subject with your lies," Jamal snapped. He flagged down the terrified maitre d' who was hovering near the doorway. "Since my ex-wife is hosting this pathetic little dinner, bring her the check right now. Let us see if her government handouts cover a place like this." He smirked, clearly expecting my card to decline. He wanted to use my financial humiliation right here in front of Trey and the restaurant staff as immediate proof of my instability for his custody case. I did not argue. I did not scramble through my purse looking for spare cash. I calmly reached into my clutch and pulled out a solid, heavy black metal Centurion card. I placed it onto the leather check holder and handed it directly to the waiter without breaking eye contact with Jamal. Jessica, still reeling from my comment about her husband's financial desperation, caught a glimpse of the heavy black metal card as the waiter took it away. Her eyes widened in absolute shock. She knew exactly what kind of wealth was required to hold that specific card, but Jamal was far too consumed by his own arrogance to notice what was happening right in front of him. "You have exactly 1 week before the mediation hearing," Jamal declared, leaning over the table and pointing a finger just inches from my face. "I have the best family lawyers in Atlanta ready to tear you apart. Enjoy your last birthday dinner with him, Zora. Because after next Monday, you are going back to being exactly what you are, an invisible, crippled failure." He turned on his heel and stormed out of the dining room, Chloe strutting confidently beside him. Jessica lingered for a fraction of a second, staring at the doorway where the waiter had disappeared with my black card before scrambling out to catch up with them. I sat perfectly still as the heavy oak doors swung shut, sealing us back in our private space. I looked at the ruined cake, slid it carefully to the side of the table, and offered Trey a warm, reassuring smile. "We will get a better cake, baby, I promise." Then I picked up my phone. I opened a secure, encrypted messaging app and typed a quick text to the head of my private security detail. "Let them think I am broke. The trap is set." 5 days later, the sterile air of the mediation room smelled of stale coffee and unearned confidence. I sat across the wide mahogany table with my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly in my lap. Next to me sat my attorney Malik, who was currently completely silent. Across from us, Jamal leaned back in his leather chair with an arrogant smirk plastered across his face. Chloe sat tightly beside him, wearing a tailored blazer that screamed of newly acquired debt, holding a designer pen she had not used once. Jamal's lawyer, a red-faced man named Harrison, cleared his throat and adjusted his tie. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of glossy 8x10 photographs. He did not pass them to Malik first. He slid them directly across the table toward me, making sure the mediator, a quiet woman named Brenda, caught a clear view. I looked down at the images. They were exactly 10 years old. In the first photo, I was sitting in a standard-issue hospital wheelchair, my legs heavily braced and bandaged. I looked frail, exhausted, and hollowed out, fresh from the combat deployment, where an improvised explosive device had nearly taken my life. In the second photo, I was struggling to hold a newborn Trey, my arms visibly trembling as I tried to balance my infant son while confined to that chair. As you can see from these historical documents, Harrison began, his voice dripping with practiced condescension. My client had to endure severe emotional and physical hardship during the brief duration of this marriage. The defendant returned from her military service as a complete physical and financial liability. My client made the difficult but necessary choice to leave an untenable situation to build a stable life. Now, 10 years later, he is simply asking the court to recognize that a disabled veteran living on a fixed government income is unfit to raise a growing, active boy. Jamal nodded solemnly, playing the part of the tragic hero. "I did what I had to do, Zora. I did not sign up to be a nursemaid to a cripple. Trey needs a real home. He needs a father who can actually provide for him." Harrison leaned forward, tapping the photos with his index finger. "We are formally requesting full physical and legal custody of Trey. Furthermore, given my client's superior household environment, We are asking the court to mandate child support payments from the defendant's veteran disability checks. It is only fair that she subsidizes her son's transition into his new wealthy lifestyle. Brenda, the mediator, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She looked at me with deep pity, clearly expecting me to burst into tears or launch into a defensive screaming match. She gently asked if I needed a moment to collect myself. I did not break eye contact with Jamal. I smiled, a sharp, cold expression that caused the smugness to falter slightly on his face. "I do not need a moment, Brenda," I said, my voice smooth and entirely level. "I need them to finish lying." Harrison scoffed loudly, gathering his photos. "There are no lies here, Ms. Zora, only documented facts. You are unemployed. You live in a basic townhouse. You rely on government handouts. My client is a successful tech entrepreneur. The contrast is undeniable." Before Malik could finally interject, Brenda called for a brief 15-minute recess to allow tensions to cool. Jamal stood up, adjusting his expensive cuffs, and walked out of the room with Chloe clinging to his arm. Malik glanced at me silently, confirming our strategy. Let them dig the hole as deep as possible before we bury them in it. I stood up, smoothing the skirt of my tailored suit, and walked out into the lobby. My 4-inch stilettos clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor, a sound that completely shattered Harrison's narrative about my physical limitations. But Jamal was not the only one waiting for me in the lobby. Sitting on the plush waiting room sofas were Jamal's parents, Calvin and Patricia. They had shown up to support their son and ensure I felt the full weight of their elite family lineage. The moment I walked through the double doors, Patricia stood up. She wore her pearls and her judgmental scowl with equal pride. "Well, if it is not the stubborn military girl," Patricia announced loudly, making sure the receptionist heard every word. "You always were too aggressive, Zora. You refused to just be a traditional soft wife and let my son lead the household. That is exactly why Jamal was forced to find comfort in Chloe's arms. You drove him away with your rigid combat mentality, and now you are trying to punish him by keeping his son hostage in poverty." I stopped a few feet away from her, crossing my arms. "It is fascinating how you rewrite history, Patricia. Your son drained my bank account and abandoned his infant child while I was learning how to walk again. That is not leadership. That is cowardice." Calvin stepped up beside his wife, puffing out his chest in a blatant attempt at physical intimidation. "Watch your tone when you speak to my wife, Zora. You are out of your depth here. You think you can fight us with your little disability checks. We will drag this out in court until you are completely bankrupt. You should just surrender the boy today and save yourself the embarrassment. Jamal is building a tech empire. He can give Trey the world." I looked at Calvin, taking in his outdated suit and his desperate need to project wealth. "You might want to check your own bank accounts before you worry about bankrupting mine, Calvin," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Before Calvin could formulate a response, Brenda stepped out into the lobby and called us back into the mediation room. I turned on my heel and walked back inside, leaving Jamal's parents standing in stunned silence. As we took our seats at the mahogany table, Jamal immediately went back on the offensive. He pounded his fist lightly on the table, demanding an immediate temporary custody transfer. He claimed that every day Trey spent in my modest townhouse was a day of emotional deprivation. Chloe nodded vigorously, adding that she had already decorated a beautiful, spacious bedroom for Trey in their Buckhead mansion. I ignored Harrison, who was busy pulling out more fabricated financial assessment forms. Instead, I reached into my leather briefcase. I pulled out a single neatly folded piece of paper. I did not hand it to Harrison. I did not hand it to the mediator. I slid it across the smooth wood directly toward Chloe. Chloe looked at the paper, then up at me with a suspicious glare. "What is this? Another one of your pathetic medical bills?" "Open it," I suggested, leaning back in my chair. Chloe unfolded the paper. Her eyes scanned the first few lines, and all the color instantly drained from her heavily contoured face. Her breath hitched. Her hands began to tremble so violently the paper rattled against the table. It was a certified notice of foreclosure on their supposedly paid-off Buckhead mansion. The document clearly stated that the property had been in default for 6 months, and the final date of eviction was set for the following Tuesday. "This is fake!" Chloe shrieked, dropping the paper as if it had burned her fingers. "Jamal, this crazy woman forged a bank document. She's trying to scare us." Jamal snatched the paper from the table. His eyes darted across the official bank letterhead, the default amount, and the unmistakable signature of the county clerk. He swallowed hard, the arrogant smirk completely wiped from his face. He knew it was real. He knew I had somehow uncovered the massive mountain of debt he had been hiding behind his flashy suits and leased cars. Cornered and desperate, Jamal's breathing grew heavy. He crumpled the foreclosure notice in his fist and stood up, knocking his heavy leather chair backward. "You think a fake piece of paper stops me?" Jamal yelled, his voice cracking with pure panic. "You think you can intimidate me, Zora? I am his father. I will just take him from that school tomorrow. I have paternal rights, and no security guard is going to stop me from taking what is mine." He did not wait for his lawyer to object. He grabbed Chloe by the arm and dragged her out of the mediation room, leaving Harrison stammering apologies to the mediator. I sat calmly at the table watching the dust settle. "Let him try," I said quietly to Malik. "Let him walk right into the snare." The color drained from Jessica's face so fast she looked ill. She took a quick step backward and bumped into a waiter gripping her designer purse like a shield. She looked around the private dining room, her eyes darting nervously to see if anyone else had heard my revelation about her husband begging me for money. Chloe whipped her head around to look at Jessica, clearly confused by the sudden shift in power, but Jamal was far too busy puffing out his chest to notice the sudden tension among his own cheerleaders. My lack of a visible breakdown was driving Jamal insane. He had marched in here expecting tears screaming and a full-blown post-traumatic stress response. He wanted a spectacle. He wanted me to look unhinged in front of the restaurant staff so he could document it for the judge. When he realized I was completely unshaken, his frustration boiled over. "Do not try to change the subject with your lies," Jamal snapped, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. He turned away from me and aggressively waved down the terrified maitre d' who had been hovering near the glass partition. "Bring the check right now," Jamal commanded, pointing a finger at the table. "My ex-wife is hosting this pathetic little dinner, so put it all on her tab. Every single cent. Let us see if her government handouts cover a place like this." Chloe smirked, leaning into Jamal. She had intentionally ordered 2 bottles of vintage champagne the moment they crashed the room, knowing full well they had no intention of staying or paying. The bill was easily going to be over $1,200. I knew exactly what Jamal was doing. He expected my debit card to decline. He wanted the waiter to return with a rejected payment so he could loudly offer to cover the meal and prove his financial superiority. He wanted to use my financial humiliation right here in front of Trey and the restaurant staff as immediate proof of my instability for his custody case. I did not argue. I did not scramble through my purse looking for spare cash or look at the waiter with panic. I maintained my perfectly level gaze. "That will not be a problem," I said. The maitre d' hurried over with a black leather folio and placed it gently on the table next to the ruined birthday cake. Jamal crossed his arms over his chest, a look of pure, triumphant anticipation on his face. "Go ahead, Zora," Jamal taunted. "Pay the man. Show Trey how well you are providing for him." I calmly reached into my clutch. I did not pull out a standard plastic debit card or a basic credit card. I pulled out a solid, heavy titanium black metal Centurion card. The kind of card you cannot simply apply for. The kind of card that requires an invitation and exceptional net worth, and a spending history that Jamal could not even fathom. I placed the metal card onto the leather check holder. It made a distinct, heavy clink against the table. I handed the folio back to the maitre d' without breaking eye contact with Jamal. "Please take care of this," I told the staff member softly. "And add a 40% tip for the inconvenience my guests have caused your staff tonight." The maitre d' nodded respectfully and hurried away. Jamal was completely oblivious. He was too busy rehearsing his next insult, too wrapped up in his own ego to look down at the table. He just assumed I had handed over a maxed-out credit card that would bounce in 3 minutes. But Jessica saw it. Jessica was obsessed with wealth and status markers. She spent her entire life trying to climb the social ladder of Atlanta. Her eyes locked onto that black titanium card before the waiter whisked it away. Her jaw practically unhinged. She knew exactly what a Centurion card looked like, and she knew what it meant. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly, as the reality of my financial status crashed down on her. Jamal, oblivious to his sister-in-law's sudden paralysis, leaned over the table. He pointed a finger just inches from my face. "You have exactly 1 week before the mediation hearing, Zora," he declared loudly, ensuring the remaining staff heard him. "I have the best family lawyers in the city ready to tear you apart. Enjoy your last birthday dinner with my son. Because after next Monday, you are going back to being exactly what you are, an invisible, crippled failure." He did not wait to see if my card declined. He wanted to make his dramatic exit on his own terms. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the dining room. Chloe strutted confidently beside him, flipping her hair over her shoulder. Jessica lingered for a fraction of a second, staring at the doorway, where the waiter had disappeared with my card. She looked at me with absolute terror before scrambling out the doors to catch up with them. I sat perfectly still as the heavy oak doors swung shut, sealing us back in our private space. The silence in the room was thick. I turned to look at Trey, who was watching the doorway with wide, frightened eyes. His hands were gripping the edge of the tablecloth. I smoothed my expression into a warm, reassuring smile. I reached out and gently squeezed his shoulder. "We will get a much better cake, baby, I promise. Nobody is ruining your 10th birthday." Once Trey relaxed slightly, I picked up my phone from the table. I opened a secure encrypted messaging app that routed directly to the command center of Aegis Cyber Defense, my company. I typed a quick message to Marcus, my head of personal security, who was monitoring my location. They took the bait. Let them think I am broke. The trap is set. I locked the screen and placed the phone back in my clutch. Jamal wanted a war over our son. He wanted to use my past trauma against me. He thought he was walking into family court to fight a broken, disabled veteran living on a fixed income. He had absolutely no idea he had just declared war on a woman who commanded millions. I was going to let him build his entire legal strategy on a lie, and then I was going to crush him with the truth. The sterile air inside the mediation room smelled of stale coffee and unearned confidence. I sat across the wide mahogany table with my posture perfectly straight and my hands resting calmly in my lap. Next to me sat my attorney Malik, who was currently completely silent. Across from us, Jamal leaned back in his leather chair with an arrogant smirk plastered across his face. Chloe sat tightly beside him, wearing a tailored blazer that screamed of newly acquired debt, holding a designer pen she had not used once. Jamal's lawyer, a red-faced man named Harrison, cleared his throat loudly. He was exactly the kind of man who charged $800 an hour to bully mothers into submission. He opened his leather briefcase with a sharp snap and pulled out a stack of 8x10 glossy photographs. He did not pass them to Malik first, as professional courtesy would dictate. Instead, he slid them directly across the polished wood toward me, making sure the court-appointed mediator caught a clear view of the images. I looked down at the top photograph. The image was exactly 10 years old. It showed a 25-year-old version of me sitting in a standard-issue Veterans Affairs hospital wheelchair. Both of my legs were encased in heavy metal braces. My face was gaunt, hollowed out from multiple reconstructive surgeries and weeks of agonizing physical therapy after a roadside bomb tore through my military convoy. In my lap, I was struggling to hold a newborn Trey. My arms were visibly trembling in the photograph as I tried to support the weight of my own child while my spine screamed in agony. "As we can clearly see here," Harrison began, his voice dripping with practiced condescension, "my client had to endure severe emotional and physical hardship during the brief duration of this marriage. The defendant returned from her military service as a complete physical and financial liability. My client made the difficult but necessary choice to leave an untenable situation to build a stable life for his son. Now, 10 years later, He is simply asking the court to recognize that a disabled veteran living on a fixed government income is completely unfit to raise a growing active boy. Jamal nodded solemnly, playing the part of the tragic hero. I did what I had to do, Zora. You know I did. I was 26 years old trying to get my tech company off the ground. I needed a partner, not a patient. I did not sign up to be a nursemaid to a cripple. Trey needs a real home. He needs a father who can actually provide for him. The word hung in the cold air. Cripple. He said it so casually, as if my sacrifice for my country was nothing more than a personal inconvenience to his lifestyle. He painted himself as a victim, completely ignoring the reality that I had taken the deployment solely to fund his initial business ventures. Chloe leaned forward, placing her manicured hand over his in a show of unified strength. Jamal suffered so much during that time, she chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. He was working so hard to build his application, and he had to come home to a depressing hospital environment. It was toxic for him, and it was toxic for baby Trey. I had to step in and provide a real maternal figure, someone who could actually walk up a flight of stairs to put the boy to bed. I watched her perform this ridiculous charade without blinking. Chloe stepped in because Jamal drained our joint savings account of $60,000 to rent her a luxury apartment, while I was learning how to swallow solid food again. They left me with nothing but medical debt and a crying infant. But I did not say this out loud. Malik had explicitly instructed me before we walked into the building to let them talk. Harrison pulled out another stack of documents. These were crisp white spreadsheets filled with fabricated numbers. Because of the defendant's unfortunate physical limitations and her subsequent inability to maintain gainful corporate employment, my client has been the primary financial pillar of this child's life. We are formally requesting full physical and legal custody of Trey, effective immediately. He slid the proposed custody agreement across the table, but he did not stop there. He pulled out a second document, tapping it with his expensive pen. Furthermore, Harrison said, puffing out his chest, given my client's superior household environment and the high standard of living Trey enjoys at their Buckhead estate, we are asking the mediator to approve a child support mandate. I finally raised an eyebrow, keeping my facial muscles completely relaxed. You want me to pay child support? Jamal smirked, leaning back in his leather chair with absolute entitlement. You get those fat veteran disability checks every month, Zora, plus whatever welfare handouts you qualify for. It is only fair that you subsidize your son's transition into his new wealthy lifestyle. Chloe and I are providing him with private tutors, golf lessons, and international vacations. Your little government checks can at least cover his extracurricular activities. They were entirely serious. Jamal abandoned me when I could not walk, stole my life savings, and now he was sitting across from me demanding a cut of my military pension to fund his fake billionaire lifestyle. The sheer audacity of it was almost impressive. Malik sat completely silent next to me. He did not object to the insulting characterizations. He did not point out that Jamal was currently wearing a suit he bought with embezzled money. He simply wrote meticulous notes on his yellow legal pad, letting them dig their own graves on the official record. Every arrogant word Jamal and Harrison spoke was being documented by the mediator. Harrison misinterpreted Malik's silence as weakness. He leaned over the table, trying to physically intimidate me. We know you live in a basic 2-bedroom townhouse, Zora. We know you shop at discount grocery stores. You cannot provide for this boy. If you fight us in court, we will drag this out until your meager savings are completely exhausted. Sign the papers today, and we will generously allow you supervised visitation 1 weekend a month. The room went completely quiet. The ticking of the wall clock sounded incredibly loud in the sterile space. Brenda, the court-appointed mediator, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She was an older woman, and she had been watching this entire exchange with deep, visible pity in her eyes. She looked at the 10-year-old photo of me in the wheelchair, and then looked at me now, sitting rigidly in my tailored suit. She clearly thought I was frozen in fear or paralyzed by the trauma of being verbally assaulted by my abuser. Ms. Zora, Brenda said, her voice soft and full of misplaced compassion. I know this is an incredibly overwhelming situation. Family disputes involving severe medical trauma are always highly emotional. Do you need a moment to step out and collect yourself? We can take a 15-minute recess if you need to cry or just breathe. Jamal rolled his eyes loudly, making sure everyone saw his annoyance. Here comes the post-traumatic stress meltdown, he muttered to Chloe. She cannot even handle a simple legal meeting without falling apart. I did not flinch. I slowly interlocked my fingers and rested my hands on the polished mahogany table. I looked directly into Brenda's eyes and then shifted my gaze to Jamal. My expression was completely stone cold, devoid of any sorrow, fear, or hesitation. I smiled, a sharp, calculated expression that caused the smugness to falter slightly on Jamal's face. "I do not need a moment, Brenda," I said, my voice slicing through the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. "I need them to finish lying." Brenda blinked her eyes wide and startled by my complete lack of emotional fragility. She looked from me to Jamal and then down at her notes, clearly out of her depth. The heavy silence in the room stretched until she nervously cleared her throat and pushed her chair back from the table. She officially called for a 15-minute recess, suggesting that everyone step out to get some air and grab a coffee from the lobby. Jamal scoffed loudly, standing up with an exaggerated stretch. He grabbed Chloe by the arm and pulled her toward the door, muttering something under his breath about how my aggressive attitude was exactly why he had to hire top-tier legal representation. Harrison packed up his fabricated financial spreadsheets with a smug look and followed them out. Malik did not move immediately. He closed his legal pad, slid it into his briefcase, and gave me a single knowing nod. The snare was set, and Jamal was walking right into it, completely blind to his own impending destruction. I stood up from the heavy mahogany table and smoothed the skirt of my tailored suit. For 10 years, Jamal had clung to the narrative that I was a broken, destitute cripple who could not even care for her own child. He had built his entire identity around being the successful tech genius who narrowly escaped a tragic, burdensome marriage. As I walked toward the heavy oak doors, the sound of my 4-inch stilettos clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor completely shattered that narrative. I moved with perfect posture, fluid grace, and absolute command of my physical space. There was no wheelchair. There were no braces. There was no hesitation in my step. I pushed through the double doors and stepped out into the expansive, brightly lit lobby of the mediation center. The space was filled with anxious families, pacing lawyers, and the low hum of stressed, hushed conversations. But the moment I entered the lobby, the hushed conversations immediately stopped. Sitting on the plush leather sofas in the center of the waiting area were Jamal's parents, Calvin and Yvonne. They had apparently shown up to support their son and ensure I felt the full intimidating weight of their family presence. The second Yvonne spotted me, she stood up, smoothing her expensive silk blouse and clutching her designer handbag. She had always hated me. Even before my deployment, she had viewed my military service as a bizarre, unfeminine rebellion against the natural order of things. "Well, if it is not the stubborn, aggressive military girl," Yvonne announced, projecting her voice so loudly that 3 separate lawyers by the coffee machine stopped to stare. I paused a few feet away from her, crossing my arms calmly. I did not say a word, allowing her to perform for the audience she so desperately craved. "You just never knew when to quit, did you?" Zora Yvonne continued, her face flushed with righteous indignation. "You always had to prove you were tougher than everyone else. You refused to just be a traditional soft wife and let my son lead his own household. You had to go off to a war zone and get yourself blown up just to prove a point. And then you expected my poor son to drop his entire future to push you around in a wheelchair. That is exactly why Jamal was forced to find comfort in Chloe's arms. He needed a real woman. Someone who could nurture his entrepreneurial spirit, instead of dragging him down with all your rigid combat mentality and endless medical drama." I looked at Yvonne, taking in her pearls, her perfect blowout, and her absolute delusion. She was standing there justifying her son abandoning his infant child and his severely injured wife, because I was not soft enough. She was blaming me for an improvised explosive device tearing through my legs because I did not stay in the kitchen. "You forced him away," Yvonne spat, taking a step closer. "You drove him right into Chloe's arms because you refused to be a proper wife." I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my choices. I simply looked at her with a cold clinical detachment. "It is fascinating, Yvonne," I said, my voice smooth and carrying effortlessly across the quiet lobby. "It is fascinating how you categorize a man draining his wife's life savings and abandoning his 3-month-old son as an entrepreneurial spirit. Where I come from, we just call that theft." Calvin jumped up from the sofa, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He marched over, standing shoulder to shoulder with his wife. He puffed out his chest, an old man desperately trying to exert physical dominance over a woman he still viewed as broken. "Do not you dare speak to my wife with that disrespectful tone," Calvin barked, pointing a thick, manicured finger at me. "You are out of your depth here, Zora. You think you can waltz into this building and demand things from my son. You are nothing but a disabled dependent living off government handouts. You are too crippled to even chase after a 10-year-old boy. Trey needs a mother who can actually walk him to the park, not someone bound to a chair popping painkillers all day." The physical reality of the situation was entirely lost on them. They were so deeply entrenched in their own fabricated narrative that they could not even process the visual evidence directly in front of them. Calvin was looking me right in the eye while calling me a cripple, completely ignoring the fact that I was standing at perfect attention in 4-inch stilettos without a single flinch or tremor. My legs, which had been painstakingly reconstructed by top-tier private surgeons and rehabilitated through years of grueling specialized training, were stronger than they had ever been. But Calvin only saw what he wanted to see. "You are a broken woman, Zora," Calvin sneered, leaning forward and stepping directly into my personal space. The smell of his heavy, outdated cologne washed over me. "You cannot provide for that boy. You cannot give him the life he deserves. Jamal is building a tech empire and Chloe comes from a respectable family with real assets. You have nothing." He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a menacing growl, attempting to intimidate me into a total surrender. "You should just walk back into that room and surrender Trey right now. Give up full custody today. Because if you force us to fight you, we will bankrupt you in court. We will hire the most expensive litigators in this state, and we will drag you through endless hearings until we drain every last dime of your pathetic little disability checks. We will leave you with absolutely nothing." Malik, who had been standing a few feet away checking his phone, finally looked up. He did not step in to protect me. He knew I did not need protection from an arrogant man drowning in his own hubris. I did not back away from Calvin. I did not break eye contact. I held my ground perfectly still, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to make him incredibly uncomfortable. Then I slowly, casually lifted my left arm. The sleeve of my blazer shifted back, revealing a custom platinum timepiece that cost more than Calvin's entire stock portfolio. I looked at the watch, checking the time with absolute indifference. I lowered my arm and met Calvin's furious gaze. A small, razor-sharp smile touched the corners of my mouth. "You might want to check your own bank accounts before you worry about bankrupting mine, Calvin." The heavy oak doors of the mediation room clicked shut behind me, sealing us back into the suffocating atmosphere of stale coffee and aggressive legal posturing. I took my seat next to Malik, smoothing my skirt with deliberate slowness. Brenda, the court-appointed mediator, offered a tight, hopeful smile, clearly praying the short recess had magically diffused the hostility. She clasped her hands together and gently suggested we resume the session with a renewed focus on constructive co-parenting solutions. Constructive solutions were the absolute last thing on Jamal's mind. He marched back into the room a few moments after me, Chloe trailing closely behind him. His jaw was set tight, his shoulders rigid. Whatever false confidence he had brought into the building was slowly being chipped away by my refusal to break, and it made him reckless. He dropped into his leather chair and immediately leaned forward, invading the space over the mahogany table. "We are done playing games here," Jamal announced, his voice vibrating with aggressive impatience. "I am not waiting for a long, drawn-out court process. I want an immediate temporary custody transfer, today." Harrison, his attorney, scrambled to catch up with his client's sudden escalation. He hastily pulled a pre-drafted motion from his briefcase, adjusting his glasses. "Yes, given the defendant's clear inability to provide a stable, emotionally supportive environment, We are formally requesting that the boy be placed in my client's primary care effective immediately pending a final judicial ruling. Jamal did not even let his lawyer finish the legal justification. Every day Trey spends in that cramped townhouse is a day. He is being neglected, Jamal stated, pointing an accusing finger directly at me. I have a fully staffed household. I have a tech company that generates real wealth. My son deserves to live in a secure, thriving environment, not a poverty trap run by a woman who cannot even handle her own trauma. Chloe sat up straighter, eager to deliver her rehearsed lines. She smoothed the lapels of her blazer and offered Brenda a sickeningly sweet, entirely fabricated smile. We have already prepared everything for him, Brenda. We have a massive custom-decorated bedroom waiting for Trey in our Buckhead mansion. It overlooks our private pool and the tennis courts. He needs space to run and play. He needs a complete wealthy family that can guarantee his future and his education. It is honestly child abuse to force him to stay in Zora's depressing little house when we have a literal estate waiting for him to claim as his own. I sat perfectly still, letting their arrogant declarations fill the sterile room. Malik remained completely silent beside me, his pen resting idly on his yellow notepad. He knew the choreography. He knew it was time. I did not launch into a passionate defense of my parenting. I did not justify my townhouse or explain the absolute warmth and stability I provided for my son. Instead, I reached down and unsnapped the brass locks of my leather briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks echoed loudly, drawing every eye at the table. I reached inside and pulled out a single neatly folded document. It was not a thick stack of medical records, a character reference, or a plea for sympathy. It was just one standard sheet of paper. I kept my eyes locked on Chloe as I slid the document across the polished mahogany. The paper glided smoothly, coming to a dead stop right in front of her perfectly manicured hands. Brenda frowned, leaning slightly forward with a look of procedural concern. Ms. Zora, all evidentiary submissions must be properly catalogued and shared with opposing counsel before they can be introduced into the mediation record. This is not an evidentiary submission, Brenda. I replied, my voice dangerously soft and perfectly even. It is simply some reading material regarding Trey's lavish new living arrangements. Chloe glared at me, her lips curling into a sneer of pure, unfiltered disgust. She snatched the paper off the table as if my very touch had contaminated it. What is this, Zora? Another one of your pathetic sob stories, a printed list of your medical ailments. We do not care. Read it, I commanded. Chloe snapped the paper open with a dramatic flourish. Her eyes darted to the bold red lettering printed across the top of the official bank letterhead. I watched in absolute fascination as the arrogant sneer melted completely off her face. The physical transformation was instantaneous and spectacular. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin an ashy, sickly gray. Her breath hitched in her throat, a sharp, audible gasp that made Harrison look up from his notes in sudden alarm. Her eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror as she scanned the contents of the page. The document was a certified, legally binding notice of foreclosure on their supposedly paid-off Buckhead mansion. It detailed 6 consecutive months of missed mortgage payments, massive accumulated financial penalties, and a final non-negotiable date of eviction set for the second Tuesday of next month. Her hands began to shake so violently the heavy paper rattled audibly against the mahogany wood. "This is fake!" Chloe shrieked, her voice pitched upward, cracking with pure panic. She dropped the document onto the table as if it were coated in acid. She turned wildly to Brenda, pointing a trembling, accusing finger at me. "She forged this. This is a fake document generated by a bitter, jealous ex-wife. She is trying to ruin us because she has absolutely nothing." Jamal scowled, visibly irritated by his wife's sudden, uncalculated loss of composure. "What are you talking about, Chloe? Calm down." He reached over and snatched the paper from the table. Jamal was a master manipulator, a man who had built an entire life and public persona on maintaining a flawless, impenetrable facade of massive success. But as his eyes locked onto the document, that carefully constructed facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of us. He recognized the official bank seal. He recognized the specific default amount, a staggering number he had clearly been hiding from everyone, including the woman sitting next to him. He recognized the signature of the county clerk. Jamal went entirely pale. The smug, condescending tech billionaire vanished, replaced instantly by a terrified, cornered fraud. His hands, usually so expressive and confident, began to tremble uncontrollably. He stared at the foreclosure notice, the reality of his impending financial ruin staring back at him in stark black and white. He looked up, his eyes locking with mine across the table. In that split second, the unspoken truth passed between us. He realized the horrifying extent of my reach. He realized that I knew everything. I knew about the failing business, the massive crippling debt, the heavily leveraged assets, and the pathetic lies he had spun to maintain his elite status in the city. He finally realized I was not the broken, helpless victim he had abandoned a decade ago. I was the absolute architect of his destruction. Cornered animals are always the most dangerous. Jamal could not process the fact that I held his complete public and financial humiliation in the palm of my hand. The sheer panic quickly morphed into explosive, uncontrollable rage. He stood up so fast his heavy leather chair tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the floor. Brenda gasped, shrinking back in her seat, her eyes wide with fear. Harrison tried to reach out to calm his client, muttering urgent legal advice, but Jamal violently swatted the lawyer's hand away. Jamal slammed both of his fists down onto the mahogany table, causing the water glasses to rattle and spill. His face was contorted with fury, a thick vein pulsing dangerously in his neck as he glared down at me. "You think a fake piece of paper stops me?" Jamal roared, his voice bouncing violently off the walls of the small room. "You think you can intimidate me with this garbage? You are a crippled nobody, Zora. I am his father. I will not let you keep him in your miserable little life. I will just take Trey from school tomorrow. I have paternal rights, and no security guard is going to stop me from taking what is mine." The very next afternoon, the sun was shining brightly over the Atlanta skyline, casting long and imposing shadows across the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corporate headquarters. I was sitting comfortably at my sleek frosted glass desk in the executive suite of Aegis Cyber Defense, located directly in the wealthy heart of Buckhead. My office was a fortress of quiet, flawless efficiency. 3 massive curved monitors sat mounted in front of me, displaying endless lines of complex code, shifting financial projections, and live global security feeds. I was in the middle of reviewing a routine cyber architecture contract for a federal client when a priority red alert suddenly flashed across my tertiary screen. The alert was not from a corporate client or a government contractor. It was a direct, heavily encrypted notification from the perimeter defense system at Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy. This was the highly exclusive, tightly monitored private school where Trey was currently sitting in his 4th period advanced robotics class. I clicked the flashing red icon. Instantly, a crystal-clear, high-definition video feed filled my center monitor. The audio kicked in a fraction of a second later, crisp and perfectly isolated from the ambient background noise. Jamal had actually done it. He had followed through on his frantic, ridiculous threat from the mediation room. He was standing right in the middle of the main reception area of Oak Ridge Preparatory, looking like a man completely unhinged. He wore a rumpled suit jacket from the day before, his silk tie loosened and hanging crookedly around his neck. His eyes were wild with a frantic, desperate energy that radiated through the screen. Chloe was nowhere to be seen. He had stormed the front office entirely alone, operating under the severe delusion that he could simply bully a group of elite school administrators just as easily as he had tried to bully me. "Bring my son out here right now!" Jamal barked loudly, slamming his open palm flat against the polished mahogany of the reception desk. "I am his father. I have full paternal rights, and I am taking him out of this facility immediately." Mrs. Higgins, the head of administration, was standing directly behind the desk. She was a composed, dignified woman with over 30 years of experience dealing with overprivileged, demanding, and occasionally irate parents. She did not even flinch at Jamal's sudden aggressive outburst. She calmly adjusted her reading glasses and looked at him with a polite but incredibly firm professional detachment. "Sir, I am going to need you to lower your voice, Mrs. Higgins said smoothly, her tone betraying absolutely zero intimidation. We do not allow shouting or aggressive behavior in the reception area. Furthermore, you are not listed on the primary emergency release authorization form for Trey. Only his mother has the legal authority to authorize an early dismissal from this campus. Jamal laughed, a harsh grating sound that echoed unpleasantly through the quiet administrative office. The sensitive audio feed picked up the slight pathetic tremor in his voice. He was absolutely terrified of the impending foreclosure. He was terrified of losing the fake, luxurious life he had built on a foundation of massive debt, and he clearly thought taking Trey by sheer force would somehow grant him immediate legal leverage. His mother is a complete mental case, Jamal yelled, leaning his body over the tall desk and pointing a finger aggressively at Mrs. Higgins. You have absolutely no idea what you are dealing with here. My ex-wife is a deeply unstable, disabled veteran. She suffered severe combat trauma, and she refuses to accept reality. She is probably sitting in a dark room right now, crying her eyes out and popping government-issued painkillers just to get through the afternoon. She is completely incapable of providing a safe environment for our son. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, resting my chin on my hands as I watched this spectacular meltdown unfold in vivid 4K resolution. Jamal was completely oblivious to the reality of his surroundings. He was clinging so desperately to the narrative of my victimhood that he could not see the actual world around him. She lives in a run-down, cheap townhouse and barely survives on military charity. Jamal continued, his voice rising in pitch as he tried to convince the staff of his own lies. I am a highly successful tech entrepreneur. I am taking emergency physical custody of my boy today before her post-traumatic stress disorder puts him in actual physical danger. He had no idea that Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy possessed the most advanced, most impenetrable digital and physical security network of any private educational institution in the entire state of Georgia. He had no idea because the school never publicly publicized the specific origin of that network. Aegis Cyber Defense. My company had completely overhauled and graciously donated the entire multi-million-dollar security infrastructure 3 years ago. Every single high-definition camera, every biometric retinal scanner, every reinforced magnetic lockdown door, and every encrypted audio feed was directly and securely linked to my corporate servers. I was not just another struggling single parent at Oak Ridge. I was their primary security benefactor and a highly valued member of their advisory board. Mrs. Higgins and the entire administrative staff knew exactly who I was. They knew I was not a broken, crying woman living in a cheap townhouse. They knew I drove a custom-armored executive vehicle and commanded a private security team. They knew I personally funded the very robotics lab where Trey was currently building drone prototypes. Mrs. Higgins looked at Jamal as if he had just sprouted a second head. She exchanged a swift, imperceptible glance with the armed campus security officer, who was standing quietly near the main hallway entrance. Mr. Zora. Mrs. Higgins replied deliberately, using his last name to emphasize his complete lack of authority and significance in this building. I can assure you with absolute certainty that we have zero concerns regarding Trey's primary care environment. His mother is a highly respected, highly capable member of this community. Now I am going to ask you one final time to step away from my desk and exit the premises before I am forced to involve campus security and local authorities. You are not involving anyone except my son Jamal, shouted, his face turning a deep mottled shade of purple. I am not leaving this building without Trey. You people are actively enabling a sick, crippled woman. I have lawyers ready to sue this entire academy into the ground for child endangerment and gross negligence. I demand you pull him out of his classroom right this second, or I will walk back there and get him myself. Jamal took a sudden, highly aggressive step toward the heavy double doors that led directly into the main academic wing. The campus security guard immediately stepped forward, raising a firm hand to physically block his path. Jamal shoved his chest hard against the guard's arm, completely losing the last remaining shreds of his rational mind. "Get your hands off me, you minimum wage mall cop!" Jamal sneered, attempting to forcibly push past the significantly larger man. I am taking my son to his real home in Buckhead today, and none of you are going to stop me. This was exactly the catastrophic miscalculation I had been waiting for. Jamal was not just violating a standard temporary custody order anymore. He was actively attempting to forcibly remove a minor from a secure educational facility while demonstrating erratic, physically aggressive, and threatening behavior toward the school staff. He was handing me the final unassailable nail for his legal coffin on a silver platter. Every single second of this physical altercation was being recorded, backed up to triple redundant cloud servers, and securely time-stamped by my security team. I reached across my wide glass desk and tapped the secure silver intercom module that linked directly to the earpiece of the lead security officer currently engaged with Jamal at Oak Ridge. The digital connection hummed softly and perfectly in my ear. I watched the live feed as Jamal continued to shove against the guard, shouting wildly about his imaginary wealth and my imaginary failures. He was digging his own grave with astonishing, unprecedented speed. I let him scream and struggle for exactly 5 more seconds, allowing his threats to be perfectly captured by the high-fidelity microphones hidden in the ceiling. Then I pressed the red override button on my console. "Lock down the front office," I commanded, my voice entirely calm, cold, and devoid of any panic. "Do not let him anywhere near the academic wing. Detain him until local law enforcement arrives. I am 5 minutes away." The drive from my corporate headquarters to the manicured grounds of Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy took exactly 4 minutes and 20 seconds. My driver Vance, a former Special Forces operator, navigated the heavy armored black SUV through the affluent streets of Buckhead with precise, calculated efficiency. He pulled the massive vehicle smoothly into the school's expansive circular driveway, the custom-reinforced tires crunching quietly against the pristine, crushed gravel. The pickup lane was already filling with the sleek luxury sedans, imported sports cars, and pristine hybrid SUVs belonging to Atlanta's elite parents. Usually this time of day was characterized by polite networking and quiet murmurs. Today, however, the affluent crowd was gathered in small, tense clusters, their attention entirely captivated by the chaotic spectacle unfolding at the main entrance. Through the tinted ballistic glass of my vehicle, I could clearly see Jamal. He was pacing furiously back and forth across the wide stone portico, completely locked out of the building. The heavy glass double doors were sealed shut, the magnetic locks glowing a solid, impenetrable red. Inside the lobby, Mrs. Higgins and the security staff stood calmly, completely unfazed by his escalating tantrum. Jamal was trapped outside, red-faced and sweating through his wrinkled designer shirt, waving his arms and shouting at the reinforced glass. Vance stepped out and swiftly opened my door. I swung my legs out, planting my heels firmly on the pavement. I smoothed the skirt of my tailored suit, adjusted my blazer, and walked toward the entrance with the measured, unhurried stride of someone who owned the very ground she walked on. The whispering among the wealthy parents died down completely as they turned to watch me approach. Jamal caught sight of me ascending the stone steps. His frantic pacing stopped instantly. His eyes widened in absolute shock to see me standing there, walking without a cane, without a wheelchair, without a single trace of the broken, destitute woman he had abandoned a decade ago. But his shock quickly morphed into an aggressive, defensive rage. He realized he had an audience of his supposed peers. He puffed out his chest, squaring his shoulders as he marched down the steps to meet me halfway. He deliberately tried to use his physical size to intimidate me, stopping just inches from my face and trying to force me to step backward. "You think you can lock me out of my own son's school? Zora." Jamal spat, his voice loud enough to echo across the entire circular driveway. "You think a temporary technical glitch in the door system is going to stop a father from rescuing his boy from a disabled, unstable lunatic? I am taking Trey today. You are making a massive fool of yourself in front of all these respectable people. You do not belong here in Buckhead. You belong in a veteran psychiatric ward." Before I could even blink, a silver convertible slammed into park just behind my armored SUV, blocking the crosswalk. The passenger door flew open and Chloe practically tumbled out onto the pavement. She had her smartphone gripped tightly in both hands. The camera lens pointed directly at my face, the red recording light blinking steadily. She sprinted up the stone walkway, her heels clicking frantically, and shoved the phone mere inches from my nose. She was completely desperate. She had clearly just processed the reality of the foreclosure notice I had handed her in mediation. The walls of her fake, luxurious life were collapsing around her, and she needed immediate, undeniable leverage. She needed the court to see me as a volatile, dangerous combat veteran. "Let everyone see the real you!" "Zora," Chloe shrieked deliberately, raising her voice to a piercing, frantic pitch. "Tell the camera how your brain is completely broken. Tell the camera how loud noises scare you and make you violent. Are you having a post-traumatic stress flashback right now? Are you going to snap and hurt someone? Look at her, everyone. She is a ticking time bomb. She cannot even walk without a handful of painkillers. You are a danger to Trey and a danger to society." She made a sudden aggressive lunging motion toward me with the phone, a deliberate physical provocation designed to trigger a defensive combat reflex. She wanted me to flinch. She wanted me to swat the phone out of her hand. She wanted me to scream, cry, or collapse into a trembling panic attack so she could upload the footage directly to her lawyer and the family court judge to prove I was an unfit mother. I did not flinch. I did not blink. My heart rate did not elevate by a single beat. I stood perfectly still, my breathing slow and completely controlled. I let her shove the camera in my face. I let her scream her vile, fabricated insults. I let the entire courtyard of wealthy Buckhead parents witness the unhinged, desperate reality of the woman who claimed to be a better maternal figure than me. I shifted my gaze away from Chloe's frantic, sweating face and looked calmly past Jamal's shoulder. The heavy glass doors of the school finally clicked and swung open. Mr. Hayes, the head of campus security and a retired Marine Corps captain, stepped out onto the portico. He was flanked by 3 heavily built uniformed security officers. Mr. Hayes did not look at Jamal. He did not look at Chloe or her recording phone. He walked straight down the stone steps, stopping directly in front of me. He snapped to attention, his posture rigidly straight, and offered a sharp, formal nod of profound deference. "Ms. Zora," Mr. Hayes said, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute, unquestionable respect. "Are you experiencing any issues with these individuals today?" I looked at Mr. Hayes, my expression entirely placid. "Mr. Hayes," I said smoothly, my voice calm and perfectly clear. "Please trespass this man and his wife for causing a disturbance on academy grounds." Jamal let out a loud, incredulous bark of laughter. He looked at Mr. Hayes and then at me, shaking his head at what he perceived as my pathetic delusion. "You cannot trespass me, Zora." Jamal scoffed, a smug, arrogant grin spreading across his face. "I am a paying parent at this institution. They are not going to listen to a crazy woman who lives on government handouts. Tell her to back off security." Mr. Hayes did not hesitate. He did not ask Jamal for his side of the story. He did not check a registry. He simply raised his hand and gave a sharp, silent signal to his men. Instantly, 2 of the massive security guards stepped forward and grabbed Jamal firmly by both arms, pulling his hands behind his back. The 2 massive guards secured their grips on Jamal's biceps with practiced military precision. Jamal thrashed violently, his expensive Italian leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the polished stone of the portico. He bucked his shoulders, trying to wrench his arms free, but the guards simply applied a fraction more downward pressure, forcing him to bend slightly at the waist. The absolute indignity of the moment seemed to fracture the last remaining piece of his sanity. He was no longer the poised, highly successful tech visionary he presented to the world. He was a desperate, sweating man, being aggressively manhandled in front of Atlanta's most elite circles. "Get off of me! I am a father. I have rights!" Jamal bellowed, spit flying from his lips as the guards began to march him forcefully down the stone steps toward the visitor parking area. "You cannot do this! I am taking my son Zora. Call your corporate dogs off. You crazy vindictive!" His insults devolved into incoherent, enraged sputtering as he fought against the relentless forward momentum of the security team. The gathered crowd of affluent parents, usually so incredibly composed and polite during the afternoon pickup routine, stood entirely frozen in shock. Several mothers pulled their children closer, shielding their eyes from the chaotic, violent display. A few fathers, in tailored business suits, exchanged alarmed, murmuring glances. This was Buckhead. Public humiliation of this magnitude was a social death sentence, and Jamal was broadcasting his breakdown live to the neighborhood's most influential residents. Chloe scrambled after them down the steps, her smartphone still raised high in the air, but her hands were shaking so badly the footage would be entirely useless. She was shrill, demanding the guards release her husband, threatening lawsuits and police action. Mr. Hayes effortlessly stepped into her path, crossing his muscular arms and blocking her pursuit with his broad shoulders. He did not say a single word, but his rigid stance was an absolute brick wall that forced her to stop dead in her tracks. Just as the guards wrestled Jamal toward the edge of the circular driveway away from the main entrance, the sharp, piercing screech of tires slicing over asphalt shattered the tension. A silver Lexus SUV blew past the designated queue of waiting luxury cars, completely ignoring the frantic crossing guards and the brightly painted stop signs. It swerved aggressively around a parked Porsche SUV and slammed on its brakes right in the middle of the loading zone, the rear end fishtailing slightly before coming to a violent, smoking halt. The driver's side door flew open, nearly clipping a large concrete planter. Out stumbled Jessica, Jamal's older sister. Jessica had always been the anxious, high-strung fixer of the family. While Yvonne and Calvin showered Jamal with endless praise and funded his endless entrepreneurial delusions, Jessica was the one who frantically swept up the disastrous financial messes he left in his wake. She served as the chief financial officer of his supposedly booming tech startup, a title that sounded incredibly impressive on a glossy business card, but essentially meant she spent her days sweating over fabricated spreadsheets, juggling his catastrophic debts, and illegally moving money around just to keep the fragile illusion of his massive success alive. Jessica took one horrified look at her brother, being physically restrained by two armed security guards, with the distinct sound of local police sirens beginning to wail faintly in the distance, and completely lost her mind. She did not care about the wealthy audience staring at her. She did not care about the pristine, highly guarded reputation of Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy. She only saw the flashing red lights of her own impending doom. "Jamal! What are you doing?" Jessica shrieked, sprinting clumsily across the crushed gravel driveway in her heels. She completely ignored me standing on the portico, her eyes locked in sheer, unadulterated terror on her brother. "Let him go. Please, he did not mean it. Jamal, stop fighting them right now." Jamal dug his heels into the ground, straining against the guard's iron grips, his face a mask of stubborn, arrogant fury. "Tell them who I am, Jess. Tell them they are illegally detaining a parent. I am taking Trey from that crazy woman today." The distant wail of the police sirens grew noticeably louder, echoing sharply off the brick facades of the surrounding academic buildings. Jessica's eyes darted frantically toward the sound, her face draining of all color until she looked entirely hollow. The sheer overwhelming panic of the situation broke her completely. The carefully guarded vault of toxic family secrets blew wide open in the middle of the crowded school courtyard. "Jamal, shut up and stop fighting!" Jessica screamed at the absolute top of her lungs, her voice cracking with hysterical, uncontainable desperation. "If you get arrested today, it is all over. The Series B investors are already auditing the main accounts. If they pull out of the app because of a highly publicized domestic arrest, you will go to federal prison for the missing funds. We cannot cover the embezzlement, Jamal. Just stop." The courtyard went instantly horribly dead silent. It was as if someone had pulled the plug on the ambient noise of the entire world. The idling engines of the luxury cars, the rustling of the autumn leaves, the distant chatter of students inside the brick buildings. Everything faded away, leaving only the devastating heavy echo of Jessica's words hanging in the crisp afternoon air. There were venture capitalists, corporate litigators, and banking executives standing in that pickup line. They all knew exactly what missing funds, investor audits, and federal prison meant. Jamal's entire social and professional network had just witnessed his absolute, undeniable ruin. Even the two highly trained security guards paused for a fraction of a second, exchanging a stunned look over Jamal's shoulders. Jamal froze entirely, the aggressive fight draining out of his body as if he had been struck by lightning. His mouth hung open, his eyes wide and vacant as he stared at his sister in pure horror. Jessica slapped both hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with the sickening realization of what she had just broadcasted to a crowd of Atlanta's most powerful citizens. Chloe, who had been standing a few feet away trying to bypass Mr. Hayes, slowly lowered her smartphone. Her arm dropped limply to her side. She stared at her husband, her face a mask of absolute paralyzing terror. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The foreclosure notice I had handed her in mediation was not a mistake. The missed payments were not a simple banking error. Her husband was not a misunderstood tech genius fighting a bitter ex-wife. He was a desperate broke criminal who had actively embezzled investor funds and was facing a lengthy federal prison sentence. She had tied her entire life, her credit, and her reputation to a rapidly sinking ship. I stood on the top step of the portico, completely untouched by the catastrophic chaos unfolding below me. I slowly reached up and adjusted the dark designer sunglasses resting on the bridge of my nose, shielding my eyes from the bright Georgia sun. The puzzle pieces clicked together in my mind with flawless, highly satisfying precision. Jamal's sudden, frantic push for emergency custody, his aggressive demand for a massive child support mandate, his absolute desperation to paint me as a rich, untouchable, disabled veteran who needed to heavily subsidize his son's newly fabricated lifestyle. He did not want Trey because he loved him. He did not want custody because he genuinely thought I was an unfit mother. I smiled a slow, razor-sharp expression. Now I knew the exact reason he was suddenly so desperate for custody. He wanted unrestricted access to my supposedly massive government disability back pay, or whatever deep pockets he assumed I was hiding to cover his criminal tracks. He needed an immediate massive cash injection to replace the stolen investor funds before the federal auditors knocked on his door. He wanted to use his own 10-year-old son as a financial shield to stay out of a federal penitentiary. It had been exactly 48 hours since Jamal completely unraveled in the pristine courtyard of Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy. The silence following his highly publicized meltdown had been absolute. He had not called. His overpaid attorney Harrison had not filed a single emergency motion. I knew exactly what that silence meant. The Blackwood family was scrambling in sheer terror, realizing the massive federal implications of Jessica screaming about missing investor funds in front of Atlanta's financial elite. They were completely backed into a corner, and cornered predators always resort to a desperate pack mentality. I was sitting calmly in the living room of my designated decoy townhouse when the assault finally began. I maintained this specific property for moments exactly like this. It was a perfectly average two-bedroom unit in a perfectly average, unremarkable neighborhood. The walls were painted a sterile builder-grade beige, and the flooring was cheap laminate. I kept the furniture basic and functional, completely devoid of any luxury or personal touch. My actual residence, a sprawling, modern smart fortress, secured behind heavy iron gates in the northern suburbs, remained entirely unknown to them. This modest townhouse was the perfect stage for the illusion of my supposed poverty, and it kept their grifting hands far away from my actual assets. The sudden, violently loud pounding on my front door shattered the quiet evening. I did not rush. I set down my tablet and walked to the entryway, checking the encrypted security feed on my phone. Standing on my small concrete porch was the entire Blackwood family tribunal. Calvin Yvonne Jamal's older brother Terrence, and a visibly trembling Jessica. I unlatched the deadbolt and opened the door a few inches. They did not wait for an invitation. Terrence immediately shoved his heavy shoulder against the wood, forcing the door wide open and pushing his way into my narrow entryway. He marched directly into my living room, completely disregarding my personal space. The rest of them swarmed in right behind him, filling the small room with the suffocating scent of expensive department store perfume and absolute desperate entitlement. They immediately fanned out, positioning themselves strategically around the cramped space in a coordinated attempt to physically intimidate me. Calvin crossed his massive arms, standing near the hallway to block any potential exit. Terrence paced back and forth in front of the basic television, sneering at the inexpensive electronics. He had always fancied himself a ruthless corporate shark, but he was nothing more than a glorified middle manager who blindly rode Jamal's coattails. Jessica hung back near the front door, clutching her designer bag tightly against her chest. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, completely unable to make eye contact with me. She looked exactly like a woman who knew she was standing on a live landmine. Yvonne, however, took center stage. She looked around the modest living room with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust curling her upper lip, as if the very air in the room was contaminated. "Look at this pathetic environment," Yvonne sneered, waving her manicured hand dismissively at my plain sofa. "You actually think this is an acceptable place to raise a growing boy? You are drowning in your own failures, Zora, and you are selfishly dragging my grandson down with you just to stroke your own massive ego. You have absolutely no concept of what it takes to build a real legacy." I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, letting her toxic, aggressive energy wash over me. I did not offer them a seat. I did not ask why they had broken into my home. I simply watched their desperate amateur performance unfold with clinical detachment. "Jamal has offered you a highly generous exit strategy," Yvonne continued, opening her oversized leather tote bag. "He is willing to take full primary custody and relieve you of this massive financial burden. You have absolutely no real career to speak of. You have no tangible assets. You are relying on government checks and military charity just to keep the lights on in this miserable little box." She reached deep into her bag and pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers. With a dramatic, aggressive flourish, she threw the wad of documents onto my cheap wooden coffee table. They landed with a heavy, insulting thud. "I printed those out for you," Yvonne demanded, her voice echoing harshly off the bare walls. "They are job applications for basic retail and administrative assistant positions. You need to get your life together, Zora. You need to stop holding our son hostage in poverty. Fill those out, swallow your foolish pride, and hand Trey over to the people who can actually guarantee his future and his education." Terrence chimed in, running a hand over his slicked back hair and adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Listen to my mother, Zora. Jamal is offering you a clean, quiet break. You take your little veteran disability checks, you get a basic entry-level job, and you disappear. If you force us to litigate this, my brother will absolutely crush you. He has a tech company backed by major aggressive venture capital. You do not have the financial resources to fight our legal team for a single week. We will expose your mental instability and your combat trauma to the judge, and you will lose everything." I looked at Terrence, taking in his puffed-out chest and his loud projection of corporate dominance. But I could see the slight frantic tremor in his hands. I looked at Calvin, whose jaw was locked in rigid, terrifying tension. I looked at Yvonne, whose arrogant, rigid posture could not hide the frantic, desperate gleam in her eyes. And finally, I looked at Jessica, who was practically shrinking into the drywall. They were all completely, utterly terrified. They had rushed over here to launch this coordinated ambush because the clock was rapidly ticking down to zero. The federal auditors were closing in on Jamal's fraudulent tech company, and the entire family was deeply legally compromised. They needed my supposedly vast military disability back pay to quietly replace the embezzled investor funds before the authorities kicked down their doors and handed out federal indictments. They were trying to aggressively bully me into surrendering my son so they could drain whatever money they thought I was hoarding to save their own pathetic lives. I did not yell. I did not defend my career, my bank accounts, or my living situation. I slowly walked away from the coffee table and moved deliberately toward the front entryway. Calvin tensed his muscles, preparing to physically block me, but I simply reached right past him. I grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door. I pulled it firmly shut until it clicked solidly into the frame. Then I reached up and smoothly turned the deadbolt, locking it from the inside. The loud metallic slide of the lock echoed sharply in the sudden heavy silence of the living room. I pulled the key from the cylinder and slipped it directly into the pocket of my tailored trousers. I turned back around to face the four of them. The arrogant, smug sneer on Terrence's face instantly vanished. Yvonne took a sudden, uncertain step backward, her breath catching in her throat. "You are not here for Trey," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm whisper that commanded the entire room. "You are here because Jamal's house of cards is collapsing and you need a scapegoat." The sudden click of the deadbolt and the absolute certainty in my voice effectively sucked the remaining air out of the cramped living room. Terrence shifted his weight uncomfortably, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the cheap laminate flooring. He exchanged a rapid, panicked look with his mother, but quickly masked it with a loud, condescending scoff. "You have completely lost your mind, Zora," Terrence sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. "Locking us in here just proves exactly how unstable you really are. We came here to give you a gracious way out of a very messy public battle, and instead you are trapping us in this depressing little box to throw around baseless accusations." I did not offer them a seat. I did not gesture toward the faded fabric sofa or the single inexpensive armchair. I wanted them standing exactly where they were confined, and acutely aware that they were strictly on my territory. The cheap beige walls of my decoy townhouse seemed to close in around them, amplifying their growing hidden anxiety. Calvin, however, was not a man who tolerated being told what his actual motives were. He stepped firmly in front of Terrence, puffing out his broad chest and adopting the aggressive, dominant posture he used to bully corporate contractors and subordinate board members. The heavy, musky scent of his expensive cologne grew stronger as he invaded my personal space, once again attempting to tower over me. "You listen to me very carefully, little girl," Calvin growled, his voice vibrating with absolute unfiltered contempt. "You are not going to stand there and invent ridiculous stories about my son. Jamal is a pioneer. He is an innovator. The only thing collapsing right now is your pathetic attempt to extort my family through the family court system. If you do not sign Trey over to us right now, we are going to completely bury you. I will personally fund Jamal's legal team. I will hire a dozen ruthless attorneys to file injunction after injunction until the legal fees drain every single penny of whatever pitiful savings you have scraped together." He pointed a thick, heavy finger toward the center of the room. "You are going to need a real job, Zora, because by the time I am done funding this custody battle, you will not even be able to afford the rent on this miserable little poverty trap." Yvonne stepped up right beside her husband, nodding vigorously in agreement. Her silk scarf fluttered as she glared at me with years of accumulated, deep-seated disdain. "We always knew you were a massive mistake for Jamal," Yvonne declared, her voice sharp and dripping with absolute venom. "The very first day he brought you to our estate, I told him you were completely wrong for our family. You had absolutely zero social grace and zero financial backing. We come from a lineage of excellence. We breed elite success and high society sophistication. You were just a rough, unpolished military girl who thought she could blindly marry into real wealth. You never belonged in our world. You lacked the pedigree and the refinement required to be a Blackwood wife." Yvonne paced a few steps across the cheap laminate floor, looking around the room as if the sheer lack of luxury offended her deeply. She reached deep into her oversized designer tote bag and pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers. With a dramatic, aggressive flourish, she threw the wad of documents onto my cheap wooden coffee table. They landed with a heavy, insulting thud, sliding across the surface and scattering near my feet. "I printed those out for you," Yvonne demanded, her voice echoing harshly off the bare walls. "They are job applications for basic retail and low-level administrative assistant positions. You need to get your life together, Zora. You need to stop holding our grandson hostage in this pathetic poverty. Fill those out. Swallow your foolish pride and hand Trey over to the people who can actually guarantee his future and his private education." I maintained my absolute silence, letting their arrogant delusions fill the physical space. They were projecting their own intense insecurities so loudly it was almost deafening. They desperately needed to believe I was beneath them, because confronting the reality of my actual power terrified them to their very core. "Just look at the rest of this family if you want to understand what real success looks like," Calvin boasted, gesturing proudly toward Terrence and Jessica. "My children are actively building the Blackwood empire while you sit around feeling sorry for yourself." Terrence and Jessica just launched their own joint commercial real estate venture last quarter. They secured prime downtown properties and are actively expanding our massive family portfolio. They are generating real generational wealth. That is the true Blackwood legacy. We build vast empires while you sit around collecting military charity and pretending you are somehow a fit mother. Terrence puffed out his chest, standing a little taller at his father's loud praise. He adjusted his expensive tailored suit jacket, making sure his luxury timepiece caught the dim light of the living room. We just closed on a massive commercial plaza in Midtown. Terrence added a smug, triumphant smirk plastered firmly across his face. It is a multi-million-dollar development project that is completely redefining the financial district. That is the kind of high-level environment Trey belongs in. He belongs around proven winners. He belongs around people who intimately understand high-level finance and ruthless corporate strategy. He does not belong with a mother who has absolutely no real career and no actual concept of how the real corporate world operates. I watched Terrence deliver his rehearsed business pitch with mild clinical amusement. He sounded exactly like a foolish man reading directly from a glossy brochure he did not fully comprehend. Jessica, however, did not look like a triumphant winner. While her father and brother loudly celebrated their supposedly massive real estate venture, she was actively shrinking against the wall near the front door. She kept her eyes glued firmly to the floorboards, her hands tightly gripping the strap of her designer purse until her knuckles turned completely white. She was breathing in shallow, rapid gasps, her shoulders hunched. She knew exactly what I knew. She knew the walls were rapidly closing in, and her father's arrogant boasting was only making the inevitable devastating impact that much worse. I let their pathetic boasting hang in the air for a long moment. The silence in the room stretched, becoming thick and suffocating. I slowly turned my back on them and walked unhurriedly toward the small side table near the front window. I did not raise my voice to defend my parenting. I did not engage with their frantic insults or their desperate, unhinged attempts to belittle my service to my country. I reached out and picked up a simple silver-framed photograph of Trey. It was a picture of him smiling brightly in his baseball uniform holding a gold trophy from last season. I wiped a tiny speck of dust from the glass, holding the frame gently and protectively in my hands. The fierce love I had for my son was a quiet, unbreakable force entirely untouched by the toxic circus currently standing in my decoy living room. I turned back to face the four of them, holding the photograph loosely at my side. My expression was entirely calm, cold, and completely unbothered by Calvin's aggressive, violent posturing. "It is fascinating that you are so incredibly proud of Terrence's business venture, Calvin," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly level, slicing right through the heavy tension in the room, especially since it is currently running on a $400,000 deficit. Terrence froze completely. The smug, triumphant sneer he had been wearing just a fraction of a second earlier vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. His perfectly tailored shoulders dropped and his eyes darted frantically toward his sister. Jessica let out a sharp, strangled gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as if she could physically shove the horrifying truth back down her throat. Calvin's face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He took a heavy, aggressive step forward, his massive fists clenching tight at his sides. "What kind of fabricated nonsense are you spewing now, Zora?" Calvin bellowed, attempting to use volume to drown out the sudden terrifying uncertainty radiating from his own children. Terrence and Jessica are fully solvent. Their business accounts are pristine. You know absolutely nothing about high-level corporate finance. I did not back down an inch. I maintained eye contact with Calvin for a brief, pitying moment, before shifting my gaze directly to Jessica, who was practically hyperventilating against my beige wall. "Your father clearly does not check the secondary ledgers, Jessica," I said smoothly, my voice echoing with clinical precision. "But I do. Did you honestly believe I was just sitting in this decoy house, blindly letting Jamal paint me as a destitute, unstable veteran in family court? When Jamal aggressively filed for emergency custody, he opened himself up to mandatory financial discovery. I did not hire a standard divorce attorney. I hired a forensic accountant with federal clearance. We tore his entire financial history apart line by line. The air in the room grew instantly toxic. Terrence slowly turned his head to look at his sister, his eyes widening with a sick, horrifying realization. Jamal did not just mismanage his own disastrous tech app. I continued methodically dismantling their entire illusion of wealth. His venture capital dried up 8 months ago, but he still needed to maintain the facade of a tech billionaire to keep Chloe happy and to keep all of you completely fooled. So he found another revenue stream. He heavily forged vendor invoices and authorized unapproved wire transfers. He embezzled exactly $400,000 directly out of your new joint commercial real estate venture. That is a complete lie, Yvonne shrieked, her voice cracking violently. My son is not a thief. He is a visionary. He is a desperate broke criminal, I corrected her sharply. And he stole your children's money to fund his mistress-turned-wife. Every single penny of that $400,000 went directly into funding Chloe's lavish lifestyle. He used your operating capital to pay for her imported sports car lease. He used your business funds to buy her diamond tennis bracelets. And most importantly, he used your massive financial deficit to fraudulently secure the down payment on that Buckhead mansion. The exact same mansion that is currently in active foreclosure because he ran out of places to steal from. Jessica let out a loud, agonizing sob, her knees buckling slightly as she slid down the wall. He promised me he would put it back. She wailed, her voice thick with hysterical panic. He said it was just a temporary bridge loan to cover his payroll. He swore to me the Series B investors were going to wire the funds by Tuesday. The absolute confirmation of Jamal's guilt hit the room like a live grenade. The vaunted elite unity of the Blackwood family shattered instantly into a million jagged pieces. Terrence lunged toward his sister, his face twisted in pure animalistic rage. You gave him access to our operating capital. Terrence screamed, spit flying from his lips as he stood over Jessica's trembling frame. You let him drain the primary accounts for a bridge loan without consulting me. I personally guaranteed those real estate notes, Jessica. I put my own house up as collateral. My wife is going to leave me. You have completely ruined my life. Jessica scrambled backwards, sobbing uncontrollably. He is our brother Terrence. He said he was going to lose everything Dad told me to always protect him. Terrence whipped his head around his eyes, locking onto his father with a murderous, unhinged glare. He took a threatening step toward Calvin, shoving a finger aggressively into the older man's chest. Did you know about this? Terrence demanded, his voice vibrating with absolute betrayal. Did you secretly authorize Jamal to raid my company to cover his pathetic failures? You forced me to bring Jessica on as a partner. You set me up to be completely robbed by your favorite son. Calvin swatted Terrence's hand away, his own temper exploding into violence. Do not ever point your finger at me, you ungrateful brat! Calvin roared, his booming voice, shaking the cheap window panes of my living room. I built this family. If Jamal needed capital, you should have come to me directly. We handle these things internally. We do not air our corporate mistakes in front of outsiders. The intervention had completely devolved into a brutal, deafening screaming match. The sophisticated high society Blackwoods were currently tearing each other to pieces in the middle of my modest decoy townhouse, acting exactly like the desperate, treacherous street brawlers they truly were beneath their expensive designer clothing. Terrence was screaming at Calvin about federal indictments. Jessica was sobbing hysterically about going to prison. Calvin was bellowing about family loyalty and corporate damage control. I stood near the hallway, an island of absolute calm in the center of their self-inflicted hurricane. They had completely forgotten about Trey. They had completely forgotten about my supposed poverty. They were actively watching their entire generational empire burn to the ground, and the flames were entirely of their own making. Yvonne stood frozen in the center of the chaos, her eyes darting between her husband and her children. The flawless, arrogant matriarch was watching her perfect legacy violently disintegrate. Her breathing turned ragged. Her pristine, highly maintained composure snapped completely. She needed someone to blame. She desperately needed a scapegoat to channel her overwhelming, destructive panic. She slowly turned her head and locked her manicured gaze entirely on me. You planned this, Yvonne hissed, her voice trembling with absolute raw hatred. You deliberately set this up. You dug into our private accounts just to ruin us. You are tearing my family apart. With a sudden unhinged shriek, Yvonne lunged forward. She raised her hand high, her heavy diamond rings catching the light as she aimed a vicious, open-handed slap directly at my face. She expected a terrified, submissive victim. She completely forgot she was attacking a highly trained military veteran who had survived active combat zones. I did not flinch. I did not step backward. My reflexes engaged with flawless muscle memory precision. I raised my arm and caught her wrist firmly in midair, stopping her violent strike, dead in its tracks just inches from my cheek. The sudden, forceful impact sent a shockwave up her arm, making her gasp in sharp, surprised pain. I held her wrist in a vice-like grip, looking directly into her terrified, wide eyes. I did not squeeze hard enough to break her bones, but I applied enough calculated pressure to make her acutely aware of exactly how much physical power I was holding back. I did not tear your family apart, Yvonne. I said, my voice dangerously soft and chillingly calm. Your family was already rotten straight to its core. I simply handed you the mirror. I pushed her hand back down gently but firmly. Yvonne stumbled backward, cradling her arm against her chest, her mouth opening and closing in complete stunned silence. The screaming match between Calvin and Terence abruptly died down as they turned to witness my physical interception. I turned my back on all of them, retrieved the key from my pocket, and smoothly unlocked the front door. I pulled it wide open, letting the cool evening air rush into the toxic, suffocating room. See you in court on Monday, I told them, my voice ringing with total, uncompromising authority. Bring a good lawyer. You are going to need one. The drive downtown to Malik's office on Monday morning was entirely uneventful. I watched the Atlanta skyline grow larger through the tinted windows of my armored SUV, my mind perfectly clear and focused on the objective. We were entering the final pretrial deposition, the last formal hurdle before we presented our case to a family court judge. This was the moment where sworn testimony became a permanent, legally binding weapon. Malik's conference room was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. It sat on the 40th floor, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a sweeping, uninterrupted view of the city. A massive mahogany table dominated the space, polished to a mirror shine. The court reporter sat quietly at the far end of the table, her hands hovering expertly over the keys of her stenotype machine, completely prepared to document every single lie. Jamal and Chloe arrived exactly 4 minutes late, a calculated power play designed to make us wait and establish dominance. They breezed through the heavy double-glass doors, looking as though they had just stepped off the cover of a high-society lifestyle magazine. Jamal wore a sharp charcoal gray tailored suit with a perfectly knotted silk tie. Chloe was dressed in a pristine white designer sheath dress, her hair flawlessly blown out, carrying an oversized Birkin bag. They completely masked the violent, screaming chaos of the weekend intervention at my decoy house. They looked polished, incredibly wealthy, and supremely confident. Their high-priced family law attorney, Harrison, trailed behind them with an arrogant swagger, clearly entirely unaware of the $400,000 embezzlement bomb ticking quietly in his client's background. Once the preliminary introductions were complete and the binding oaths were administered, the performance officially began. Jamal took the lead. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood, adopting an expression of profound manufactured sorrow. He had clearly spent the entire weekend being heavily coached by Harrison on how to manipulate the narrative. He did not speak with his usual aggressive anger. He spoke with the quiet, practiced exhaustion of a saintly martyr. He began to systematically rewrite our entire shared history. According to his sworn testimony 10 years ago, he was a brilliant, hard-working young entrepreneur, desperately trying to hold a broken, fragile family together. He painted me not as an active duty soldier recovering from the severe physical and mental tolls of combat, but as a completely negligent, detached, and selfish burden. I came home from long hours of building my startup. Jamal testified, looking directly at the stenographer to ensure she captured his exact tragic tone. And I would find Zora just sitting in the dark. She was a complete shell of a woman. She was entirely unresponsive to her environment. I would hear my infant son crying in his crib down the hall, completely ignored. I had to do absolutely everything. I had to be the breadwinner, the mother, and the father. She could not even change a single diaper without having a severe, paralyzing panic attack. She was entirely unfit then, and she is entirely unfit now. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my posture reflecting years of strict military discipline. I did not glare at him. I did not shake my head in denial. I simply listened to the man who had abandoned me in a military hospital bed spin a legally binding fairy tale where he was the ultimate suffering hero. Then it was Chloe's turn to take the stage. She was sworn in and immediately reached into her Birkin bag, pulling out a small lace-trimmed handkerchief. She dabbed at the corners of her perfectly lined eyes, squeezing out a few highly forced pathetic tears. She shifted her posture, projecting the image of a deeply concerned, loving maternal figure who was desperately trying to rescue an innocent child from peril. Chloe turned her attention to the present day, launching a calculated, vicious assault on my decoy townhouse. She described the modest beige living room she had never actually set foot inside, relying entirely on the frantic, disgusted descriptions provided by Yvonne and Jessica after their failed weekend ambush. "It absolutely breaks my heart," Chloe said, her voice trembling with practiced theatrical emotion. "Trey is a bright, vibrant, growing boy. He requires a healthy, active, financially stable mother figure to thrive. Zora cannot provide that. She lives in a cramped, depressing little box of a townhouse. It is an environment completely devoid of culture, opportunity, or basic comfort. He is essentially being held hostage in poverty because of her stubborn, selfish pride." She paused, dabbing her dry eyes once more, ensuring the court reporter caught every single syllable of her dramatic performance. "Trey needs stability," Chloe continued, her voice growing firmer and more righteous. "I provide that stability. I provide an elite, upper-class environment in Buckhead. I provide him with the unlimited resources he needs to succeed. Zora is a traumatized combat veteran who relies entirely on military charity and cheap government assistance. She is a completely broken woman. She is a danger to his emotional development. He belongs with a family that can actually afford to give him the world." Malik sat to my right, casually flipping through a thick yellow legal pad. He was a ruthless, highly calculated shark in the courtroom, known for his aggressive cross-examinations and razor-sharp objections. But today he was entirely deliberately silent. He did not raise his hand to object to their rampant, baseless speculation. He did not interrupt to strike their emotional hearsay from the official record. Instead, Malik leaned back in his leather chair, steepled his fingers together, and gently encouraged them to keep talking. He asked probing, open-ended questions, giving them miles of legal rope to hang themselves with. "So you are stating for the record that your current financial situation is completely secure?" Malik asked, his tone mild and incredibly conversational. "You assert that your household is entirely solvent and capable of providing a superior standard of living without any external assistance." Jamal sat up straight, practically puffing out his chest, eager to validate his massive ego on the record. "Absolutely," Jamal confirmed, his voice ringing with arrogant pride. "My company is thriving. My venture capital backing is rock solid. We own a multi-million-dollar estate in Buckhead outright. Our financial portfolio is completely bulletproof. We have the unlimited resources required to give Trey the absolute best life possible. Zora brings nothing to the table but instability and extreme poverty." "Yes," Chloe chimed in eagerly, desperate to cement her status as the wealthy superior savior. "We have zero financial concerns. We are completely prepared to take over full financial responsibility for Trey immediately." Malik offered a small, polite nod, his face giving absolutely nothing away. "Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood. Let the record reflect that you have sworn under oath to your complete financial solvency and the absolute stability of your business assets." I sat perfectly still in my chair, my breathing slow and entirely measured. I watched Jamal lean back, a deeply smug, satisfied smirk spreading across his face. He looked at me with an expression of total unearned victory. He truly believed he had just delivered the final fatal blow to my custody case. He believed his heavily coached performance had successfully painted me as a destitute, unfit, crazy veteran in the eyes of the court. He thought he had completely outsmarted me. He had absolutely no idea that every single word he and his wife had just spoken on the record was documented verifiable federal perjury. He had no idea that the federal auditors were currently ripping through his fabricated corporate spreadsheets, or that the bank had already finalized the foreclosure paperwork on his pristine Buckhead mansion. Malik did not object because he did not need to. He was actively letting them build a massive, undeniable record of perjury. Every lie they told about their wealth, every arrogant boast about their financial stability was another heavy nail in their legal coffin. Jamal smirked at me across the mahogany table, silently daring me to react, daring me to show a single crack of emotion or weakness. I simply held his gaze, my face an unbreakable mask of stone, and watched a dead man enthusiastically dig his own grave. Harrison adjusted his posture clearly, sensing that the emotional stage of the deposition had reached its maximum theatrical potential. He unclasped the brushed steel latches of his pristine Italian leather briefcase with a sharp, echoing snap. He reached inside and withdrew a thick, heavily disorganized stack of printed paperwork. He did not hand them directly to Malik. He slid them toward the court reporter, first officially entering them into the permanent legal record before passing a duplicate stack across the mahogany table to us. I glanced down at the pages without touching them. They were bank statements, tax summaries, and heavily redacted utility bills. It took my defensively trained eyes less than 4 seconds to recognize exactly what I was looking at. They were fabrications. They were incredibly clumsy, amateurish fabrications. Jamal had clearly taken the minimal expense reports from my decoy townhouse, wildly inflated them, and completely erased any incoming revenue streams. He had doctored federal tax documents, an incredibly bold and staggeringly foolish federal crime, to make it appear as though my net worth was hovering dangerously below the national poverty line. Harrison stood up, pacing slowly behind his seated clients, adopting the solemn, deeply concerned cadence of a man who believed he was rescuing a child from absolute ruin. "We have submitted Exhibit B for the record," Harrison stated, his voice resonating with slick, aggressive confidence. "These documents clearly and undeniably outline Zora's complete financial insolvency. As you can see, she possesses absolutely no tangible assets. She has zero liquid capital. She is currently relying on a meager, heavily subsidized military stipend to maintain a completely inadequate residence. She is actively hiding small amounts of unreported cash just to avoid providing a baseline standard of living for her son. She is destitute, overwhelmed, and entirely incapable of sustaining the financial requirements of a growing active child." I watched Harrison pace, my face an unbreakable mask of stone. I was actually fascinated by the sheer staggering magnitude of his professional negligence. Any competent, high-priced family law attorney would have independently verified financial documents before submitting them into a sworn federal deposition. But Harrison had allowed his own arrogance, coupled with Jamal's wildly inflated ego, to completely blind him. He had blindly trusted a man who was actively being hunted by federal auditors. He was eagerly tying his own legal license to a sinking ship made entirely of forged paperwork. Therefore, Harrison continued, stopping directly behind Jamal and placing a supportive hand on his client's tailored shoulder. "We are officially submitting a formal, expedited request for an immediate emergency custody transfer. My client is the only parent capable of providing a safe, elite, and financially secure environment. Furthermore, to ensure that Trey's basic needs are met during this transition, we are demanding full, unrestricted administrative access to Zora's military pension accounts and all associated Veterans Affairs back pay. It is the only ethical way to ensure Trey's absolute well-being is not compromised by his mother's financial failures." The sheer audacity of the demand hung heavily in the chilled air of the conference room. They did not just want to take my son, they wanted to legally hijack my supposed military disability checks. They were so incredibly desperate for a cash injection to cover the $400,000 Jamal had embezzled from his own sister that they were attempting to use the family court system to legally rob me. They wanted to use Trey as a highly profitable pawn to keep the federal authorities away from their Buckhead mansion. Jamal leaned heavily into the microphone positioned in the center of the table. He wanted the final word. He desperately needed to feel like the dominant, conquering patriarch. He looked directly across the polished mahogany, his eyes locking onto mine with an expression of pure, unadulterated venom mixed with a sick, triumphant glee. The court needs to step in and aggressively protect my son from this absolute welfare lifestyle, Jamal stated, enunciating every single word so the stenographer could capture the full weight of his manufactured disgust. Trey deserves to be raised in a stable, high-value environment. He deserves culture, private education, and financial security. I can provide the world for him. Zora cannot even provide a decent neighborhood. She is broken. She is unstable. Jamal smiled directly at me, a slow, incredibly arrogant curling of his lips that showed all of his perfectly whitened teeth. She has absolutely nothing to offer my son but trauma and debt. Jamal concluded, sitting back in his plush leather chair and crossing his arms in total victory. The silence that followed his statement was heavy, thick, with the toxic, suffocating ego radiating from his side of the table. Chloe beamed at her husband, her earlier fake tears completely forgotten, replaced by a smug, self-satisfied glow. She truly believed they had just won. She believed she was walking out of this building with a brand new son and unrestricted access to a fresh stream of military cash to fund her failing lifestyle. Malik did not immediately respond. He let their aggressive, insulting demands settle permanently into the official binding record. He sat perfectly still, his eyes focused entirely on the yellow legal pad resting in front of him. He slowly reached out and picked up his expensive, heavy silver fountain pen. He tapped the tip of the pen against the polished mahogany table. Once, twice, 3 times. The sharp metallic clicking sound cut through the heavy silence of the room, drawing everyone's immediate attention. Malik finally cleared his throat. He did not look at Jamal. He did not look at Harrison or Chloe. He turned his head slowly and looked directly at me. His expression was entirely devoid of any emotion, a perfect, unreadable canvas of lethal legal strategy. "Ms. Zora Malik," said his deep, resonant voice, entirely calm and conversational, cutting sharply through the lingering echoes of Jamal's arrogant insults. "For the official record, so there is absolutely no confusion regarding your ability to provide for your son, could you please state your current profession and your primary source of income?" I kept my posture rigidly straight. I did not glare at Jamal or offer a triumphant smirk. I operated with the cold, calculated precision of a sniper aligning the crosshairs on a completely oblivious target. I leaned forward, bringing my face perfectly level with the recording microphone resting on the table. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Cyber Defense." The immediate reaction from across the table was explosive, unhinged amusement. Jamal practically threw his head back and burst into loud, braying, hysterical laughter. The sound bounced aggressively off the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, filling the executive conference room with his toxic, fragile ego. He slapped his hand flat against the mahogany table, shaking his head as if I had just delivered the punchline to a magnificent joke. "Oh, this is absolutely incredible!" Jamal choked out between gasps of fabricated laughter, pointing a mocking finger in my direction. "Are you getting all of this down for the record?" She is completely delusional. She sits in her tiny, depressing little apartment playing video games all day, and now she thinks she runs an imaginary cyber company. She is so incredibly desperate to look good for the court that she is just inventing fake corporations out of thin air. This is exactly the kind of severe mental instability I have been warning everyone about. Chloe joined in, letting out a high-pitched, condescending giggle. She leaned over to whisper something in her husband's ear, covering her mouth with her manicured hand, her eyes locked onto me with pure, unadulterated pity. They were putting on a spectacular performance, fully convinced they were witnessing the pathetic, rambling breakdown of a destitute veteran. Even Harrison, their supposedly high-tier, sophisticated attorney, could not completely mask his amusement. He let out a low, smug chuckle, adjusting his silk tie and shaking his head in mock sorrow. He looked at Malik with an expression of professional sympathy, as if apologizing that his opposing counsel had to deal with such an unhinged, delusional client. Malik did not smile. He did not chuckle. His face remained a mask of absolute terrifying stone. He unlatched the heavy brass clasps of his thick leather briefcase resting on the floor beside his chair. He reached inside and withdrew a massive, incredibly heavy black binder. The binder was thick bound in reinforced material and stamped with an official raised gold federal seal on the cover. Malik lifted the binder with both hands and set it down on the polished mahogany. It landed with a deep, authoritative thud that instantly silenced the residual giggling from Chloe. Malik placed his large hand flat on top of the black cover and slowly, deliberately slid the massive binder across the smooth table. It glided silently, stopping exactly an inch in front of Harrison's manicured hands. "We submit Exhibit A for the impending trial," Malik stated, his voice ringing with cold, absolute finality. "This binder contains my client's fully certified financial disclosures, heavily verified by federal forensic accountants. It also contains the unclassified military addendums regarding her active government contracts, her corporate revenue streams, and her complete unrestricted ownership of Aegis Cyber Defense." Harrison's smug, condescending smile faltered slightly, but he retained his arrogant posture. He clearly still believed this was a desperate bluff, a stack of heavily fabricated paperwork meant to intimidate him. With a dismissive, overly dramatic sigh, Harrison reached out and flipped open the heavy black cover of the binder. He looked down at the very first page. It was a completely unredacted, federally certified statement of corporate ownership. It detailed the highly classified multi-billion-dollar defense contracts Aegis Cyber Defense actively managed for the Department of Defense. It listed the massive, staggering liquid capital currently resting in the corporate accounts. And it clearly, undeniably listed Zora as the sole uncontested founder and 100% equity owner. I watched Harrison's reaction with quiet, clinical satisfaction. It was an absolute masterpiece of psychological destruction. The color completely drained from Harrison's face in less than 2 seconds. His healthy, tanned complexion turned the shade of wet concrete. The arrogant, slick confidence that had defined his entire career vanished completely, entirely, replaced by a look of sheer, paralyzing horror. He realized in a fraction of a second that he had just officially submitted clumsily forged financial documents against a multi-billion-dollar federal defense contractor on a sworn permanent legal record. He was not just looking at losing a custody case. He was staring directly down the barrel of immediate disbarment, catastrophic civil litigation, and highly probable federal prison time for aggressively facilitating financial fraud against a government entity. Harrison's hands began to shake violently. The thick, crisp pages of the federal documents rattled audibly against his gold cufflinks. He tried to swallow, but his throat was completely dry. He looked up, his wide, terrified eyes locking onto Malik, who was simply staring back at him with the cold, dead eyes of an executioner. "We need a recess," Harrison stammered, his voice cracking and pitching upward in sheer panic. "We need an immediate recess." Jamal's triumphant braying laughter cut off instantly. He looked at his attorney, his brow furrowing in deep, arrogant confusion. He had expected Harrison to tear my supposed delusions apart to laugh me out of the room. He did not understand why his highly paid bulldog was suddenly hyperventilating over a simple stack of papers. "What are you talking about?" Jamal demanded, his voice laced with aggressive irritation. "Why are we stopping? We are destroying her. She just lied on the record about owning a fake company." "Push the advantage, Harrison. We are winning this right now." Harrison slowly turned his head to look at his client. The look on the attorney's face was not one of confusion or strategy. It was a look of pure, unadulterated dread. He stared at Jamal as if he were looking at a walking, talking corpse. Harrison realized he had been completely, utterly played by a desperate, broke grifter, and that grifter had just dragged him directly into a federal kill zone. The heavy, reinforced oak doors of the Fulton County Family Court swung open, and Jamal strode into the packed courtroom with the unearned, highly inflated swagger of a conquering king. It was the morning of our final custody trial, and he had clearly spent the entire intervening period actively ignoring reality. He was dressed impeccably in a sharp, bespoke navy suit, a crisp white shirt, and a luxury timepiece that I knew for an absolute fact was purchased with stolen capital. Chloe walked closely by his side, clutching her oversized designer handbag, her head held high as if she were walking a red carpet rather than entering a legal battlefield. They looked entirely flawless. They also looked entirely delusional. Jamal's attorney Harrison trailed several paces behind them, looking like a dead man walking. The slick, aggressive confidence Harrison had displayed at the beginning of our deposition was completely gone, utterly eradicated by the contents of the black binder Malik had slid across the mahogany table weeks prior. Harrison's skin was a sallow, sickly gray. Dark circles hung heavily beneath his eyes, and his expensive leather briefcase seemed to drag his entire shoulder down toward the floorboards. After the catastrophic revelation of my certified federal disclosures, Harrison had undoubtedly tried to advise his client to surrender. Any competent lawyer would have instantly recognized that proceeding to trial against a federally verified multi-billion-dollar defense contractor while relying on clumsily forged financial documents was legal suicide. But Jamal was a narcissist of the highest order. He had clearly convinced himself that Harrison's panic attack was just a minor lapse in nerve. Jamal assumed that Malik was simply bluffing, that the unclassified military addendums were elaborate fakes, and that my entire corporate identity was just an imaginary, desperate ploy to look good for the judge. Jamal had completely ignored his own counsel, blinding himself with his own towering arrogance, and marched directly into a federal kill zone. I sat at the defense table, my posture perfectly rigid, my back straight, and my shoulders squared. Years of strict military discipline dictated my movements. I wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit that projected quiet, undeniable authority. I did not fidget. I did not glare. I simply watched the opposing table with the cold, clinical detachment of a sniper, waiting for the target to walk into the crosshairs. Malik sat beside me, his demeanor completely relaxed, his large hands resting lightly over his pristine yellow legal pad. The bailiff called the packed room to order, and the Honorable Judge Sterling took her seat at the high bench. Judge Sterling was a formidable, no-nonsense African-American woman with a legendary reputation for mercilessly shredding anyone who dared to waste her time, manipulate her courtroom, or perjure themselves on her watch. She adjusted her reading glasses, her sharp, intelligent eyes scanning the room before settling heavily on the thick files placed before her. Right at the very top of her reading pile sat the heavy black binder. Harrison, looking as though he were physically forcing his legs to move, called Jamal to the witness stand. Jamal practically floated to the wooden box. He raised his right hand, placed his left hand on the Bible, and swore a binding oath to tell the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, under penalty of perjury. He settled into the chair, adjusting his suit jacket, completely oblivious to the legal execution that was about to take place. "Please tell the court why you are seeking an immediate emergency custody transfer of your son," Mr. Blackwood Harrison asked. His voice was completely devoid of its usual theatrical flair. He read the question flatly from a notepad, deliberately avoiding eye contact with the judge, trying desperately to distance himself from the impending explosion. Jamal leaned into the microphone. He looked directly at Judge Sterling, expertly plastering a look of profound, agonizing paternal concern across his handsome face. "Your Honor, I am here because I am absolutely terrified for my son's physical, mental, and emotional well-being," Jamal stated, his voice ringing with rehearsed tragic sorrow. "Trey is currently trapped in an incredibly toxic, impoverished environment. His mother, Zora, is a completely broken woman. She is a destitute, disabled college dropout who flatly refuses to work, refuses to integrate into society, and refuses to provide a baseline standard of living for our child." I sat perfectly still, letting the sheer magnitude of his lies fill the official court record. Every single word was being captured by the court reporter. Every single syllable was a felony. "She lives in a tiny, dilapidated, utterly depressing townhouse," Jamal continued, gesturing vaguely with his hands to emphasize the supposed squalor of my decoy home. "She has absolutely no career prospects, zero savings, and no tangible assets whatsoever. She relies entirely on a meager government stipend and welfare programs to survive month to month. She uses our son as an emotional crutch, manipulating the family court system to collect child support she does not even spend on him. She is completely financially insolvent and severely mentally unstable. Jamal was fully in his element now. He was playing to the packed gallery, playing to his wife Chloe, who sat in the front row, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue and attempting to play the formidable judge. He painted a vivid, disgusting, entirely fabricated picture of my supposed welfare lifestyle. He detailed imaginary mental breakdowns, fabricating dramatic, unhinged stories about me, refusing to leave my bed for days at a time, or failing to provide basic nutritious meals for Trey. Trey desperately needs a healthy, active, and financially stable environment to thrive. Jamal testified, his chest puffing out with arrogant pride. I have built a highly successful multi-million-dollar tech enterprise. I can provide him with private tutors, elite international travel, and the kind of high society cultural exposure his mother cannot even begin to comprehend. She has absolutely nothing to offer him but trauma, government debt, and a lifetime of severe poverty. She is entirely unfit to raise a child of his caliber. At the plaintiff's table, Harrison squeezed his eyes tightly shut. His hands were gripping the edges of the wooden table so fiercely that his knuckles had turned completely white. He knew exactly what was inside the black binder sitting directly in front of Judge Sterling. He knew Jamal was actively committing multiple counts of federal perjury right on the official court record. He knew that every arrogant boast Jamal made about his own supposedly thriving tech enterprise was completely fraudulent, entirely undermined by the $400,000 he had embezzled from his own sister. But Harrison was completely powerless to stop the speeding train. Jamal had chosen his path, and he was sprinting down it. Jamal leaned closer to the microphone, his smug, triumphant confidence reaching its absolute zenith. He felt untouchable. He felt like a king. He slowly turned his head and smiled directly at me, a vicious, mocking smirk that silently declared his total, undisputed victory. The court must act immediately to protect my son from her welfare lifestyle, Jamal concluded, his voice echoing loudly in the silent, tense courtroom. She has nothing to offer him but trauma and debt. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed his arrogant statement was instantly shattered by the sharp, authoritative sound of a wooden gavel striking the sound block. Judge Sterling did not look amused. She did not look even remotely sympathetic to his tragic, heavily fabricated tale of paternal woe. She sat rigid behind the elevated bench, her hands folded neatly on top of the massive black binder Malik had formally submitted into evidence. Her dark, piercing eyes locked directly onto Jamal, completely stripping away his arrogant, polished facade in a matter of seconds. She held up her hand, a single commanding gesture that stopped Jamal dead in his tracks, just as he opened his mouth to add another layer to his pathetic, manufactured story. The sheer terrifying weight of her presence instantly sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the courtroom. Mr. Blackwood, Judge Sterling said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, razor-sharp register that carried perfectly across the vast room. Are you entirely certain of the testimony you are providing regarding the defendant's financial and professional status? Jamal did not catch the lethal underlying warning in her tone. He was too blinded by his own towering ego, too absolutely convinced of his own superior intelligence and his flawless manipulation of the court. He assumed she was simply confirming his victory for the record. He puffed his chest out slightly more, adjusting his expensive tie as his smug smirk widened. Absolutely, Your Honor. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed Jamal's arrogant declaration was instantly shattered by the sharp, authoritative sound of a wooden gavel striking the sound block. Judge Sterling did not look amused. She did not look even remotely sympathetic to his tragic, heavily fabricated tale of paternal woe. She sat rigid behind the elevated bench, her hands folded neatly on top of the massive black binder Malik had formally submitted into evidence. Her dark, piercing eyes locked directly onto Jamal, completely stripping away his arrogant, polished facade in a matter of seconds. She held up her hand, a single commanding gesture that stopped Jamal dead in his tracks, just as he opened his mouth to add another layer to his pathetic, manufactured story. The sheer terrifying weight of her presence instantly sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the courtroom. Mr. Blackwood, Judge Sterling, said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, razor-sharp register that carried perfectly across the vast room. Are you entirely certain of the testimony you are providing regarding the defendant's financial and professional status? Jamal did not catch the lethal underlying warning in her tone. He was too blinded by his own towering ego, too absolutely convinced of his own superior intelligence and his flawless manipulation of the court. He assumed she was simply confirming his victory for the record. He puffed his chest out slightly more, adjusting his expensive tie as his smug smirk widened. Absolutely, Your Honor. Judge Sterling held his gaze for a long, agonizing moment. She did not blink. She looked at Jamal, not as a wealthy tech entrepreneur, but as something fundamentally repulsive that she had just discovered stuck to the bottom of her judicial robes. The absolute unshakable confidence radiating from the bench began to crack the edges of Jamal's smug expression. He shifted uncomfortably in the witness box, his expensive leather shoes squeaking faintly against the wooden floorboards. Slowly, deliberately, Judge Sterling broke eye contact with Jamal. She shifted her attention downward to the heavy black binder resting in front of her. She reached out with steady manicured hands and grasped the thick, reinforced cover. The entire courtroom held its collective breath. The ambient hum of the courthouse air conditioning system suddenly sounded as loud as a commercial jet engine. She opened the binder. The crisp, heavy crackle of high-grade, federally watermarked paper echoed through the dead-silent room. Judge Sterling adjusted her reading glasses, sliding them slightly down the bridge of her nose as her eyes scanned the very first page. I sat perfectly still at the defense table, my back completely straight, watching the exact moment the Blackwood family's entire fabricated universe began to collapse. As Judge Sterling read, her expression underwent a terrifying transformation. The initial look of judicial neutrality melted away instantly, replaced by a mixture of absolute, unadulterated disgust and profound disbelief. She ran her index finger down the margin of the page, tracing the certified federal seals and the heavily audited corporate ledgers. She flipped to the second page, then the third, her movements becoming sharper and more aggressive with every piece of indisputable evidence she processed. She looked up from the documentation and locked eyes directly with Harrison. Jamal's high-priced attorney was currently gripping the edge of the plaintiff's table so hard his knuckles were entirely white. Harrison was sweating profusely, a thick sheen of panic glistening on his forehead. He knew his legal career was actively burning to ashes in front of him. He gave the judge a tiny, imperceptible shake of his head, a pathetic, silent plea for mercy that she instantly rejected. Judge Sterling turned her furious, searing gaze back to Jamal. The smirk had finally vanished from his face. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly above his tight silk collar. He looked at Harrison for guidance, but his attorney refused to make eye contact, choosing instead to stare blindly at the polished wood of the table. Mr. Blackwood, Judge Sterling, said, her voice vibrating with a cold, lethal fury that commanded absolute authority. Perjury in my courtroom is not a tactical maneuver. It is not a strategic game you play to manipulate family law. It is a direct malicious assault on the integrity of this judicial system, and it is a one-way ticket to a federal holding cell. Jamal gripped the edges of the witness stand. What he stammered, his confident baritone suddenly sounding incredibly small and weak. Your Honor, I do not understand. I have provided my financial statements. I have told you the truth about her situation. You have provided nothing but an offensive, highly fabricated fiction, Judge Sterling snapped, slapping her hand flat against the open pages of the binder. You sat in that chair under a binding legal oath and painted the defendant as a destitute, incapable ward of the state. You confidently claimed she has absolutely nothing to offer her child but extreme trauma and severe poverty. Here. Judge Sterling picked up the first certified page from the binder, holding it up, so the heavy embossed gold seal of the United States Department of Defense caught the harsh fluorescent lighting of the courtroom. She took a deep, steadying breath, preparing to drop the ultimate reality-shattering payload directly onto the official court record. She reads a single sentence aloud into the court record. The plaintiff claims the defendant is an unemployable disabled liability. Yet this unclassified Department of Defense record classifies her as a Tier 1 cyber defense contractor, sole owner of an enterprise valued at $85 million, currently holding active top-secret clearance. The words slammed into the courtroom like physical kinetic strikes. Jamal physically recoiled. His entire body jerked backward in the witness chair, as if he had just been struck violently across the jaw. The healthy, vibrant color drained entirely from his face, leaving behind a sickly ashen gray. His jaw dropped completely open, his eyes bulging as his brain frantically tried to process the massive, incomprehensible numbers that had just been read aloud. $85 million. No? Jamal gasped out loud, his voice cracking into a high, panicked squeak. No. That is not possible. That cannot be real. She lives in a cheap townhouse. She drives an old car. That is impossible. In the first row of the gallery, Chloe had been leaning forward, eager to witness my final destruction. The exact moment Judge Sterling said the words $85 million, Chloe's meticulously maintained posture completely collapsed. Her manicured hands went entirely limp. The oversized, authentic Birkin bag slipped from her loose grip. It hit the polished wooden floorboards of the gallery. Thud. The heavy, solid sound echoed brutally through the dead-silent courtroom, marking the exact definitive moment the Blackwood empire completely flatlined. Malik did not give them a single second to breathe. He did not allow the shock to settle, or give Harrison any room to launch a desperate, flailing legal objection. Malik stood up from his leather chair, his tall, imposing frame casting a long shadow across the defense table. He buttoned his suit jacket with smooth, predatory grace. The final phase of our operation had officially commenced. Your Honor, Malik stated, his voice ringing with absolute, unyielding authority. The defense has one final submission for the record. The plaintiff's sudden, highly aggressive interest in modifying this custody arrangement was never about the welfare of his son. It was a calculated, incredibly desperate attempt to access my client's assets to save himself from impending federal prosecution. Jamal scrambled to his feet in the witness box, completely ignoring the basic rules of courtroom decorum. That is a lie, Jamal screamed, his voice bordering on sheer, unhinged hysteria. I am a highly successful entrepreneur. My company is thriving. I just secured a massive round of venture capital. Sit down immediately, Mr. Blackwood, or I will have the bailiff physically restrain you. Judge, Sterling roared, pointing a commanding finger directly at his chest. Jamal collapsed back into the chair, his chest heaving with rapid, panicked breaths. He looked around the room with wild, terrified eyes, realizing the walls were rapidly closing in and completely crushing him. Malik reached into his secondary file box and pulled out 3 distinct, heavily labeled financial addendums. He walked calmly toward the bench, handing the stack of documents directly to the court clerk. Your Honor, I direct your attention to the forensic trace documents labeled A_20, followed by the secondary asset ledger titled B_20, and finally the federal indictment preamble marked C_20. Malik stated, enunciating each file name with crystal clear precision. These documents, compiled by independent federally certified forensic accountants, outline the complete and total insolvency of Mr. Blackwood's tech enterprise. His application platform is nothing more than a sophisticated, highly leveraged Ponzi scheme. He is currently facing a massive, multi-million-dollar federal indictment for aggressive wire fraud and severe investor embezzlement. Malik turned slowly, sweeping his gaze across the terrified faces of the Blackwood family, sitting frozen in the gallery. Calvin and Yvonne looked as though they had just been physically struck by lightning. Mr. Blackwood knew his federal indictments were imminent. Malik continued twisting the legal knife deep into Jamal's chest. He knew his bank accounts were about to be frozen. He utilized heavily forged documents, which his attorney blindly submitted to this court to paint my client as destitute. His ultimate goal was to secure full custody of his son, legally demand massive retroactive child support from my client's multi-million-dollar defense company, and use those funds to pay for his criminal defense team. He attempted to use his own child as a financial shield against federal prison. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, terrifying silence of total, inescapable ruin. Judge Sterling's face was an absolute mask of righteous judicial wrath. She looked down at the forensic documents cross-referencing the staggering evidence of fraud with the forged paperwork Harrison had so arrogantly submitted. She did not need to deliberate. She did not need to hear another single word from the plaintiff's table. "The depth of your depravity is truly staggering, Mr. Blackwood," Judge Sterling said, her voice shaking with barely contained fury. "You have actively attempted to manipulate this court, perjure yourself under oath, and utilize your own flesh and blood as a pawn to cover up your extensive criminal activities." She picked up her heavy wooden gavel. "The plaintiff's petition for an emergency custody transfer is denied in its absolute entirety," Judge Sterling ordered, her voice echoing like thunder. "Furthermore, based on the overwhelming evidence of severe financial instability, documented criminal fraud, and blatant malicious perjury, I am hereby revoking your existing visitation rights effective immediately. You present an active, clear, and present danger to the well-being of this child." Jamal let out a loud, pathetic whimper, burying his face in his trembling hands. Finally, Judge Sterling concluded, her eyes locking onto Harrison, who was practically melting into his chair. "I am ordering the bailiff to immediately impound all financial documents submitted by the plaintiff today. They are to be directly referred to the district attorney's office for immediate criminal prosecution regarding perjury and the submission of fraudulent documents to a family court judge. This court is adjourned." She struck the gavel hard against the sound block. The loud, decisive crack signaled the complete, total annihilation of Jamal Blackwood. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my charcoal suit jacket. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply gathered my belongings with the quiet, efficient dignity of a woman who had just successfully executed a flawless tactical victory. The hallway outside the courtroom was a scene of absolute unhinged chaos. The polished elite facade of the Blackwood family had been violently ripped away, exposing the desperate, toxic reality hiding underneath. Chloe was standing near the heavy wooden doors, her face twisted into a mask of pure, vicious rage. She was screaming at Jamal at the absolute top of her lungs, completely ignoring the stares of passing attorneys and court staff. "You lied to me!" Chloe shrieked, shoving her finger aggressively into Jamal's chest. "You told me you were a billionaire. You told me we were completely secure. You are broke. You are going to federal prison, and you expect me to stay married to a pathetic, broke felon. I am leaving you. I am filing for divorce this afternoon." Jamal reached out desperately, trying to grab her arm. "Chloe, please, you have to listen to me. I can fix this. I can get another round of funding." Chloe slapped his hand away violently. "Do not touch me," she screamed. She turned on her expensive heels, clutching her retrieved Birkin bag against her chest, and marched rapidly down the long corridor, completely abandoning him in his darkest hour. As I walked calmly toward the main exit, accompanied by the silent, protective presence of Malik, I saw Calvin and Yvonne desperately pushing through the crowded hallway. The arrogant, condescending monsters who had invaded my decoy townhouse just days prior were completely gone. They looked terrified, pathetic, and utterly broken. They rushed up to me, physically blocking my path to the elevators. Yvonne had actual tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. Her hands were clasped together in front of her chest in a desperate begging gesture. "Zora, please," Yvonne sobbed, her voice cracking with hysterical panic. "You have to help us. You have $85 million. You have more money than we could ever imagine. Please, you have to give Jamal a loan. You have to help him pay for a criminal defense attorney. He is going to go to federal prison. They are going to take everything we have. Please, Zora, we are family. We can fix this." Calvin stepped forward, the proud, bellowing patriarch reduced to a trembling, desperate old man. "Zora, I will give you whatever you want. I will sign over the commercial real estate deeds. Just give us access to the capital. You cannot let the father of your child go to a federal penitentiary. Please show some mercy." I stopped walking. I looked at the two of them, taking in their red-rimmed eyes, their trembling hands, and their absolute humiliating desperation. I remembered the way Yvonne had sneered at my cheap beige walls. I remembered the way Calvin had aggressively pointed his finger in my face, threatening to bury me in legal fees until I was completely homeless. I remembered the way they had blindly supported a man who had abandoned me when I was broken and recovering from war. I looked at my former in-laws with cold, absolute power. The kind of power that does not need to raise its voice. The kind of power that is earned through blood, sweat, and unbreakable resilience. Failures don't belong in my family, I stated, my voice echoing with terrifying lethal calm as I quoted their exact arrogant words directly back to them. I stepped gracefully around their frozen, stunned bodies. I did not look back. I walked smoothly through the heavy sliding glass doors of the courthouse and stepped out into the bright, warm Atlanta sunlight. I walked directly to the curb where my waiting, heavily armored chauffeured Maybach sat idling perfectly. The driver opened the heavy rear door for me. I slid into the luxurious leather interior, adjusting my suit jacket one final time. The door closed with a solid, satisfying thud, instantly silencing the frantic, chaotic noise of the courthouse steps. "Take me back to the office," I told the driver smoothly. I leaned back against the plush headrest and watched the courthouse shrink in the rearview mirror, driving back to the massive, undeniable empire I had built entirely from the ashes they had left me in. The most profound lesson here is that your worth is never defined by the toxic people who underestimate you, even if they share your DNA. True security and freedom come from building your own financial independence, trusting your capabilities, and establishing unbreakable boundaries. When you finally stop seeking validation from those committed to misunderstanding you, you create the necessary space to build an authentically successful life. True family is built on mutual respect and support, not obligation. Hit the like button and share your own story of reclaiming your power and setting boundaries in the comments below.